portraying the roles of soldiers' wives is presented by Dawn Haggis. Dawn is the managing editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, is an independent researcher specializing in the demographics and material culture of the British Army and the American Revolution. He maintains a blog about British common soldiers and has published a number of articles in academic journals. His books include Revolution's Last Men, Soldiers Behind the Photographs, British Soldiers, American War, A British Soldier's Story, American War, A British Soldier's Story, Roger Lamb's Narrative of the American Revolution, General Orders, Rhode Island, and Wives, Slaves, Servant Girls. More recent works include Noble Volunteers, the British soldiers who fought the American Revolution, and These Distinguished Corps, British Grenadier and Light Infantry Battalions in the American Revolution. So, I'd like to welcome Dawn Haggis.
Okay, I know how to speak. All right, thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm actually going to start my talk by doing something incredibly rude and giving an answer to the question on the previous talk. This is my answer to the question about why we call the Battle of Bunker Hill. And the answer is, in my opinion, because the battle itself took place all over the Charleston Peninsula. The Americans built a redoubt on a hill called Breed's Hill, but the British objective was to capture Bunker Hill. So to that, it was a battle fought to capture Bunker Hill. The rail fence, where much of the battle was fought, isn't on Breed's Hill either. So just because the Americans built a fort on Breed's Hill doesn't mean you have to call the battle Breed's Hill. And if you tell people, oh, actually it was the Battle of Breed's Hill, you're just coming across as fanatic. So it's the Battle of Bunker Hill because that was the objective of both sides. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm going to talk about women in the British Army. My thing is to study the people who were in the British military during the American Revolution. And I study both the soldiers themselves as individual people and their wives as individual people. If you've ever tried to do this, you'll find it's really, really hard because the information is so scattered. But there's a lot we can learn, and I know I'm talking about to an audience of bringers here, so I'm going to say some things you already know, but also things you don't, or things you might not, rather. And I want to give people ideas about how to portray the roles of these women in the kind of context that most of the 18th century reenactments you may go to actually afford you to portray them in. So, we already know that the Army wife is a working woman, right? If you're going to be in a military camp, even if your goal isn't to portray a soldier's wife, there's a good chance that you're portraying somebody who has to work for a living. So how do you do that? Well, just to put that into some context, I'm going to give some 18th century information and some modern information about how to apply the 18th century stuff. A soldier's base pay was insufficient to support a family. Now, proving that I don't know how to talk to the mic here, sorry about that. And employment helped not only earn money, but also to prevent idleness. So if you keep people busy, they stay out of trouble, right? So it's not only to earn money, it's also to keep people at work and not by the hands. Ah, yes, too close to the amplifier. Okay, now I'm really cool. Maybe I should just put it back in here. Even though I hate to start still this way. All right, here we go. Here we go. So to portray an Army woman, you want to be a woman at work. If you're going to be around a military camp, you should be doing some kind of work, keeping busy. But the challenge is that a lot of the work that women did for the Army were associated with aspects of military infrastructure that we don't usually portray at a reenactment. We tend to portray a camp that was more like something on a campaign than something that was in a town. And I know there's arguments because we actually fall kind of in between those two extremes a lot. But let's look at the most common jobs for women in the Army to have. There were washerwomen, nurses, sutlers, what I call private sellers. We'll talk more about each one of these individually. Gardeners and seamstresses. So we're going to go through these individually and talk about a little bit about what they were and a lot more about how to portray that effectively. Washerwomen. I use the term washerwomen because that's the one that appears by far the most common in the period documents that I look at. We do see the term laundress in the 18th century from time to time, but not very often in military documents. So I'm going to call them washerwomen, even though it's a little bit harder to say. In a British company, which was about 50 soldiers, there are 1 to 3 washerwomen in the company. These are wives of soldiers in the company. In the British Army, you probably find somewhere around 1 out of every 6 or 8 soldiers are married and have their wives with them with the Army. So put that in context. And a couple or 3 of those women are probably going to be washing for the soldiers. The rates that they charge are usually regulated by the Army, but this is one of the hardest things to find detailed documentation on. I wish I could say, and a washerwoman earns this much per week, but I just can't say that because I don't know. Men paid the washerwomen either directly out of their own pockets or indirectly by keeping accounts kept by regimental officers. It really depended on whether the soldier could be responsible with his money or not. I have a lot of information in my book, Global Volunteers, which is for sale in the room, about this subject. And we do know that British soldiers sometimes did their own laundry, so it's really hard for us to be absolute and say, oh, they didn't wash their shirts, they washed all the trousers, because we know that there were no absolutes associated with it. Now let's talk about recreating laundry. Well, in terms of the several different roles I've talked about, this is probably the easiest for an individual to do. Is that font big enough to read in the back of the room, by the way? Can people read that? Okay, good. I'm just making sure. Always want to make the slide better next time. It's an easy job for an individual except for that unwieldy wash tub. Now, up until a few days ago, this slide said that big unwieldy wash tub. And then I started looking a little more carefully at pictures and realized that wash tubs don't have to be big to do wash tubs. So it's still kind of a sticky, wet, ugly thing, but it doesn't have to be big. All the pictures I'm going to show you are of British military camps, most of them around London in the 1780s. The reason I use these pictures is because we just don't have pictures of British or American encampments, not enough to give the level of detail we want, and also because we suspect that long-term encampments of the type you might find in Rhode Island or around New York, places where an army spent a long time in camp, may well have started to resemble these camps in England, where troops stayed in camping for months at a time. We can't be certain, but we can suspect, and we have to use what information we have, right? So it's hard, it's messy work, but it's visually appealing. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make it more visually appealing. And there are related tasks like soap making and ironing and other things that tie in with just doing the wash. So here's some pictures that give examples of things to illustrate. Here's a woman with a wash tub, and she's got her wash tub in a wheelbarrow, which is kind of cool because not only is it a lot easier to move around, but there's a visual appeal to it. In the other side on the right, the woman has a wash tub, but it's up on a stool of some sort. So think outside of the tub, I guess. Because remember, everything we want to do, we want to portray something for an audience that wants to look at things with visual appeal. And one thing that really has visual appeal are clotheslines. I started to notice that clotheslines show up over and over and over again, and they're not real fancy. You see the one over there on the left? There's just a big stick of a tree there, the one on the right on the top. These are just crude posts cut off of branches of trees. The one on the bottom here appears to be strung between two tents. It's hard to really see. There are some other ones, the one on the upper left, strung between two tents, but then with a prop up in the middle of it. I grew up in the country where we used clotheslines and sticking that pole up in the middle of the clothesline, that kind of thing. All different sorts of them. Down in the lower left, you see, well, there's women spreading clothes out to dry. Just on the ground, on the camp street, rather than on the clothesline. So again, these are things just that people can see and look at, and then you can interpret and talk to people about, oh, here's what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. Here's my other new favorites is, okay, clotheslines. Well, just find a piece of rope that's already there. So there's clothes, two different examples of clothing just hanging up on marquee ropes, which is fantastic, I think. I also have a written account by a German soldier who was at the siege of Yorktown, and you may know about the storming of the redoubts in Lane 10 at Yorktown. This German officers alone, and there were clothes hanging out on the phrases, those sticks that were sticking out in front of the redoubt, and women hung up clothes to dry on these things. So there's a lot to do it again. You don't have to necessarily even do any laundry to have this kind of thing going on to show that, to represent the idea that you're a washerwoman in a camp setting. Nurses. This is one of my favorite jobs because guess what? Clara Barton was not the first military nurse. All British military hospitals had nurses. This is not a picture that has any pictures. It's just such a lovely picture of a woman from the 18th century there. A British regiment, which is about 500 men, is just a general figure if you give a sense of scale, might employ one or two wives as nurses. But then in wartime, the British also set up military hospitals outside of the regimental hospitals where they also employed wives as nurses. And nursing at the time was not something to go to nursing school for. It was a lot more just basic cleanliness and caregiving. So there was no training associated with being an army nurse. But there's a lot of things you can do to portray this. Nurses administered the patient's diets, they administered medications, they took care of basic hygiene. Let's talk about how to represent this. Say, okay, before that, sometimes this was a voluntary task, sometimes it wasn't. So every regiment to send two wives to the hospital as nurses. And if you don't respond, then they're going to get assigned to do the job. If they get assigned to do the job and refuse to do it, then they get drugged out of camp. But it was a lucrative job. I found rates as much as $1 per day for nurses, which compared to a soldier's base pay of 8 pence a day. And just to prove that I'm not lying, this is an actual contingent bill for the 35th Regimental Foot for the second half of the year 1775 when they were in Boston. And if you go partway down, I'm sure there's a laser pointer on here somewhere. Hit center button. Right down here we've got, let's see, 12 weeks for 2 nurses for the hospital, and it gives the rate of pay that they got, which works out to $1 a day. And then down here, after 24th of September, we've got only 1 nurse in the hospital. Well, this is right after the Battle of Bunker Hill. So early on, we need 2 nurses from the regiment because there are so many casualties. Then over time, as they heal or get discharged from the hospital, then we got to eating them anyway. The point is that this job paid really well in the context of work in the 18th century, work in the time period. So how do you recreate a nurse? Well, nurses are in army hospitals only. You don't have anything like battlefield nurses, which makes it a bit of a challenge. But in any encampment, it's perfectly appropriate to set up a regimental hospital somewhere on the periphery of the camp. Now, that's hard for an individual to do, but it's not so hard to have a group of people working together on it. And what I would love to see, most people, most women who join the reenactment hobby end up associated with a regiment, right? But you don't need to be limited by that. You can form a reenacting group that is the Army Hospital or the Regimental Hospital. You don't need to tie yourself to anybody's regiment to do this. And And the hobby, quite frankly, needs more of this kind of thinking. You don't need to have a surgeon to have a hospital. Think about a hospital ward today. How often is the doctor on the ward? Maybe hardly ever, but how often are the nurses on the ward? All the time. The nurses are the ones who are always present at the hospital. So, I mean, there are people who do these great portrayals of army surgeons, and that's a wonderful thing. They've got all their saws and knives and bloody aprons, but you don't need any of that. Most of the guys in the hospital are wounded, they're sick. And most of the time, the doctor's not around anyway. So you can portray a hospital without having a doctor or a surgeon or an apothecary or any of that stuff. You need a tent or 2 tents. Or if you have a building, that's really great to do. You don't need that. Just a couple of tents, some bolsters filled with straw, medicines, a diet board. We'll talk a little more about that in just a second. And it doesn't hurt to have a few guys who are just too tired or lazy or hungover to actually go out and do anything else except lie around to be your patients in the hospital. It shouldn't be a hard thing to put together. Now, getting into the things that you can demonstrate as a nurse, well, these are all slightly paraphrased quotations from military orders of the time period or military textbooks talking about how to run a hospital. Nurses are to keep patients as neat and clean as the nature of their distempers will admit of. That sounds a little bit skeevy, but that's what nursing is about, right? To give them their diet regularly. Okay, so you're giving the food to the patients. That's something demonstrated. A diet board for each nurse on which are the names of the sick men that she attends and also the nourishment to be given to them. Well, that's great. Now you've got something you can actually show and hold and walk around with, which, you know, we need the material culture things. I don't have the foggiest idea what the diet board looked like. I could guess that it's a chalkboard or something, which makes sense. Possibly one of these board work things with a clear front and a piece of paper under it. But you can figure that out, right? It could just be a piece of paper or a notebook. Their food properly dressed, pots, kettles, etc., free from cockroaches. Okay, well, so we're preparing the food for the patients. That's part of the work of the hospital. Now we're really getting somewhere. Tea and sugar to be supplied to the patients weekly, rather. See that the patients take the medicines ordered by the physicians. So now we've got more material culture to introduce the medicines and how they're carried, how they're administered. Keep the wards clean, sprinkle with vinegar, fumigate them with the smoke of wetted gunpowder, frankincense, or any other aromatic, again, things you can show that you're doing. Chamber pots and close stools, empty, well washed. Now we're getting some great stuff. You can clean chamber pots. Okay? Maybe focus on some of the other things more than that. But you see where there's a lot of material culture things you can do to bring a hospital to life and have something you can show and demonstrate. Orders hung up in every military hospital to show the nurses their duty. Again, something to demonstrate. Nurses not to go out of the hospital without having a ticket of leave signed by the physician, surgeon, apothecary, or head nurse. So again, a ticket of leave of pass when you're a nurse, but you're not in the hospital. So there's a lot of visuals and a lot of things you can handle and show to people here. And it doesn't have to be complicated or require $1 billion worth of surgeons to do this. Sutlers, what do we mean by a sutler? A sutler is a licensed purveyor of provisions for the army. So they sell stuff, and they sold in the 18th century, in the Revolution, sutlers sold anything that soldiers would buy, which pretty much means they sold liquor, because soldiers don't need to buy much stuff besides liquor. The army provides them with a lot of things, right? Now, we can also document sutlers selling things like tobacco, soap, cheese, bread, and other odds and ends, occasionally things like shoes. But for the most part, they're selling liquor, because for the most part, that's what soldiers want to buy. Clearly, we don't want to be selling liquor at an enactment limits, but there are things you can do to portray a sutler. I have a few slides here to just show the variety of sutling booths that show up in these pictures. Camps,
in the 18th century because I like them. This picture probably doesn't show up very well, but on the right there's a beautiful sutler's tent, this big marquee type of tent, and there's a real party going on inside. And next to it is another sutler's tent that clearly is just thrown together out of boards and rods and pieces of cloth and anything else that can be thrown together. In this one, in the background, there's a sutler's booth that's a little building. And in the middle, there's a sutler's tent. It's a nice tent. And then in the foreground, there's a carriage with the wheels taken off, but when the sides opened up, it's pretty much like taking a food truck and knocking the wheels off. But it shows the variety of ways that sutlers might be conveying things. And there's even simpler ways to do it if you don't want to go out and buy a carriage and knock the wheels off and put it around. So recreating the sutler, it can be difficult because it requires a lot of stuff. Well, what do you do if you don't want to get a lot of stuff? You work together with other people. And here again, I'd love to see somebody and say, oh, what group do you belong to? Instead of saying the Fourth Middlesex Militia, they say, oh, I'm with Mrs. Swindle's Sutlery. And me and my 12 other people, we get together at the events and we put together this sutling group. Some of us own this part, and some of us own that part, and one owns the tent, some of the others own. You can do these things if you work as a group, and again, you can have a reenactment group that's not tied to somebody's regiment. These pictures just show how simple a sutling tent can be. In the upper right, it's a lean-to, but if you take a regular tent that has flaps in both the front and the back, you can use this as your very own tent to sleep in, and then during the day, you can rearrange it with some long poles into this sideways sort of A-frame type thing, and make a sutling booth out of it. How about that? You don't need a lot of extra stuff to do it. In the upper left, on the very left-hand side, again, I apologize if it doesn't show up so well. These things look so close up. And I'll be very happy to share these images with anybody who wants them. On the far left, there's just an awning thrown over a pole that looks like it's a great big old Persian rug or maybe a wall-hanging tapestry or something like that. And it's nothing fancy. Lower left, we have just an arrangement of sheets and pieces of cloth to make screwed partitions. And the only reason I guess that this has something to do with sutling is that you can just barely make out there's some tables and chairs inside. So again, it's just a cordoned off space. It doesn't even have a cover over it. The one on the bottom left is important because it's just an awning. Now, looking closely, I was like, okay, that one has a building and a bunch of giant hogsheads and barrels and other things. Well, it's kind of assembled from whatever is around, but if you can just make an awning, the site you're going to go to just has a building or some trees. You can put together a sutling with hardly anything. So the point is to not be limited by thinking that you need a whole lot of stuff in order to do something that has some visual appeal that gives a vehicle for demonstration to the public. Private sellers, this is my own terminology just to distinguish these people selling things in camp from these sutlers that are licensed by the Army. A private seller could be anybody selling goods to the military who isn't a licensed sutler. Sometimes this was tolerated by the military and sometimes not. We find orders to allow people from the town or soldiers' wives who are licensed to be selling things and orders for them to be chased away, depending on the context. It's often local women selling things to the army. Recreating a private seller isn't very difficult. You can just start looking at pictures of private sellers from the time period. The Cries of London, there's a few other cries that just show the wide variety of things people will sell and the way they carried them and made them be for sale. So here's your chance to go out to a reenactment and walk away at the end of the weekend with more money than you arrived with. Wouldn't that be a nice thing? How do you do that? Look around and look at the kinds of things that everybody needs. I say everybody, I'm kind of leaning toward all the soldiers at least. Every regiment has their own distinct things that they need, but there are a lot of almost generic things that everybody needs, like cockades. You can make a whole bunch of cockades, because guess what? They fall out of people's hats and they get lost, and people need new ones. And they're pretty similar to each other. Non-perishable food is always a great thing to make. Bread or other kind of things from the period. Thread, always nice to have good period thread. Stockings, everybody always needs good stockings. Get a bunch of them, walk around, sell them at the event. Knives, gun flints, neck stocks, handkerchiefs, pamphlets, bayonet scabbards. There's something that's almost generic across any unit, right? Now, I know that during the 18th century, I would find a woman walk around the camps on gun flints and bayonet scabbards, right? So we kind of make some allowances here. You might disguise the scabbards a little bit for the public, but sell them privately. But the point is to think of things that lots of people need lots of. And you might be able to make a little money by having them available and selling them in the camps. And just to prove that I am not making this up, this picture on the side here is by Francis Wheatley. And the title, it's a detail from a painting, but the title of the painting is "Soldier with Country Women Selling Ribbons Near a Military Camp." So it doesn't get much more blatant than that, but this is something that happens during the time period. Selling food, that's always a good thing to do. General Borders lived in Rhode Island in 1779 said, "There being great reason to suppose that soldiers are encouraged to plunder fields and gardens by soldiers' wives and other small retailers purchasing from the vegetables so stolen." So we have petty merchants, small retailers who are selling vegetables that have been procured by soldiers who are plundering the farm fields. And guess who they're selling those vegetables to? Other soldiers. Round and round it goes. Gardening, this one gets a bit on the periphery of the ability to directly associate it with work of army wives. I have not found any official nice military order saying every regiment to send X number of wives to work in gardening. But I have found plenty of orders for soldiers and regiments when they're in one place for any amount of time to set up gardens. And anywhere around town, common activity for a local person too. We also know that army hospitals have hospital gardens. So if you set up that hospital, here's something in addition besides all the other things we talk about the hospital. But how do you portray gardening at a reenactment? Well, you gotta be a little bit creative, but you can do it. You bring some tools. You can bring some modern shovels as well as the 19th century, some nice period-looking ones. And you bring some vegetables to plant at the event. Till the ground, which you can do the night before or early in the morning. You can get some soldiers to help you out and just dig up a patch of ground to make the garden. And then take some nice fully grown potatoes or turnips or carrots or other root vegetables and put them in your garden. And then all weekend you can be out there with your hoe or your rake and you can be tilling around these vegetables and telling people what you're doing and why you're doing it. Take it in shifts, but you can take the same vegetable all weekend, dig up and replant the same things over and over. I mean, it might sound a little silly, but think of how cool it will be when a family comes up and you can say, here, you think your son or your daughter wants to take the hoe and see if they can find a turnip in the garden? Just think how effective that is. So there's some serious work involved here, but it's a really great interpretation. And again, it can tie in very nicely on the periphery of the camp or associated with an army hospital, give this really great vehicle for interpretation, and be a perfectly valid thing for a soldier's wife or a member of the local population to do. Other kinds of military employment that we can document, but we can't really interpret very usefully. The Army had women go out and help with the haying, because when the hay has to come in, it has to come in right now. So everybody goes involved. Peat cutting, if you're in Rhode Island and you happen to be an Irish woman who knows a thing thing or two about cutting peat. You get sent out to the peat bogs, which didn't make peat that was as good as your peat in Ireland, but there it was. Again, this is not something we can portray very well, but I throw it out there just to show the variety of kinds of work the Army had to offer. And we'll get back to things that you can portray. A lot of seamstress, a lot of sewing going on in the camps, in the modern reenactment camps. But sewing for the Army was usually done by the Army's own tailors, but not all of it. When the Army did a lot of things quickly, they asked for the women to help out the tailors. I'll give you some examples in a moment. Typically, this was for items where we needed a lot of them quickly. So, for example, Thomas Simon goes, I've got the young officer's rights. No sergeant to be employed to buy necessaries for the men. Necessaries are shirts, stockings, and shoes, for the most part, things that are necessary to replace on a frequent basis. No sergeant to be employed to buy necessaries for the men shall receive any advantage thereby, except that of employing his wife to make up the linen. Okay, so a sergeant's wife or a corporal's wife might be making shirts. The Army. Royal Artillery orders in Montreal. All the old tents to be cut up into trousers for the men. The women in the 3 companies of artillery to be employed in making them. Okay, so now we're getting women making military clothing. And going down to Charleston, South Carolina in 1780, the tailors and women of the whole brigade to be employed in cleaning the 1st Battalion with trousers. Boston, 18th Regiment, May 1775. The tailors and those women who choose to comply to be set to work tomorrow morning at making officers' tents. A British Army surgeon wrote, we employed all of our women, soldiers' wives, intended for nurses in the hospital, in sewing 4,000 bandages, which we 2 surgeons made that week. Now, I have no idea what sewing a bandage entails during this time period, but here's some sewing that we're doing. Again, see the tie-in with the hospital, more depth to the impression. So how do you recreate doing this kind of work in a camp setting? Again, work as a group. Get a nice defined area that looks like a place where a project is going on. If you can find like a corner outside of a building or a nice setting under a tree or somewhere that looks like an established space, however you can create that. And then work together on either what's the same project or what can look like it's the same project. Once again, who would like to walk away from the reenactment on Sunday afternoon with more money than they arrived with? Anybody? Make something that is widely used that you can work together to produce. For example, men's shirts. You could sit together and see how many of these you can manufacture in a weekend and probably sell a lot of them. Gaiters that actually fit around the person's leg in such a way that they will keep all of the crap out of the low-top shoes like they're supposed to. Just look around and see how many look like little accordions bunched up around the ankles are useless. I imagine how cool it would be to have a couple of people say, hey, I will fit your gaiters for you. Drop them off and come back in an hour and I will have them re-stitched so that they fit your leg the way they're supposed to. Or do it while you wait, whatever works. You can make some money doing this stuff and also improve the hobby at large. Make haversacks. Everybody needs haversacks. They're almost generic, right? So look for the things, again, that people need a lot of, and then, set up the Continental Shirt Factory, which was an actual thing in Philadelphia in the 1780s, and just make the stuff that people need. You can make a lot of things partially made. Men's shirts are such that you can partly make them up and then fit them to the individual and finish them off at the event. So you can not only be entrepreneurial, but you can provide a great service while you're doing it, and also, again, when the public comes around, what are you doing? We're the women of the town making shirts for the Army because we need them. All right. Just a few more little odds and ends before we finish this up. How many jobs are we talking about that the Army can provide? Well, a typical British regiment, which, Again, the nice ballpark figure when you see the word regiment is to think of it as about 500 men. Clearly, sometimes they're bigger, smaller, all kinds of stuff. But if you have that in mind, it just gives you the order of magnitude we're talking about. It says 10 regiments were here and 5 regiments there. And that gets you close enough. You're usually going to find 60 to 80 women in a regiment this size. So you're usually going to find about 30 of them working as washerwomen. See, I use the word laundress, even though I said I wasn't going to. About 10 of them working as nurses at any given time, and maybe 5 or so of them working as licensed sutlers for the Army. So that's about 2/3 of the soldiers' wives could earn income just by working for the Army directly. And then, of course, the other third has to figure out their own ways to make money, but we've already seen some of those possibilities here. All right, so just as a reminder, the 6 most common employments that British Army women and probably American Army women have when they're associated with the military encampment are washerwomen, nurses, sutlers, private sellers, gardeners, and again, a little bit of a caveat around that one, but it's really good for reenacting, and doing seamstressing work. That's all I got right now. I do have a blog. If you really want to know about individual British soldiers or individual wives or individual soldiers' children, I have lots of good stories about them on my blog. I have an email address if you want more information about any of this. And as Jim mentioned, I'm the managing editor of Journal of the American Revolution, which you can subscribe to absolutely free at allthingsliberty.com. And I can take questions, even though I've probably pretty much already told you everything I know.
My question is, I've heard that women who did work with the Army also got official rations. Do you know how that worked as opposed to getting paid or getting paid?
Okay, the question was, women working for the Army got official rations. As a generality, in the British Army, again, which is my thing, British soldiers' wives who accompanied the Army did get rations from the Army, irrespective of the work part. So if you could do work for the Army and also get rations, you could come off the top because, hey, the Army's providing you food for it. Does that answer the question? Okay. There's one in the back, then one in the front.
The photos with multiple tents, do you know where that came from? Where that image?
Oh, I do know where the images came from, and we can talk about that after class here. I can get them to you. We'll sort that one out. But yeah, these images are from places like the British Museum, the Yale Center for British Art, and places like that. But I got them all on my computer right here. If you got a USB stick, yeah, give them to you.
Is this set up for just couples without children? And if the soldier dies, what happens to the soldier?
Okay, there were 2 questions there. One, does this only deal with couples with no children? The answer is no. I didn't talk about children, but I said 60 to 80 wives in a regiment, typically. Similar number of children at any given time. So some of these women are single, some are childless, some have children, some have multiple children. That was question 1. Question 2 is what happens after the woman dies. I have another talk that really goes into, just focuses on stuff in the 18th century, but when the woman's husband dies, the British Army gives her the option of going back to her husband's place of birth, wherever that may be. It's usually going to be somewhere in Great Britain. She gets passage on the ship getting home, and then she gets a sum of money to get her to wherever that town is. And she also is entitled to any of her soldier husband's back pay and any of his property that he owns. Interestingly, I found some cases where widows of British soldiers, soldiers who died in America, end up getting married again to other soldiers in the Army, but not for a couple of years in some cases. So there's one actually who was killed on April 19th. So I know the man, I know who his wife was, and she gets married again, I think it was 3 years later in New York. Now what was she doing in the meantime? No idea. Because everything we know about her is in that marriage record that says she's the widow of this guy and now she's marrying that guy. And by looking at muster roll, you can find out when that guy died. But we at least know that sometimes widows and other single women stayed with the army. But the information that is so fragmentary, I can only guess that she must have been doing some kind of useful work in the army and was able to support herself. But overall, yeah, the widows get sent home. They're not just cast off by any means. This question straight up the wall. Yes.
Similar question to the earlier one about money. In
Yes.
this case, we're talking pounds, shilling, pence, or are these people operating local currency, or how does that work?
Oh, that's a great question. So the money, how did that work? Well, one of the unfortunate things is that we don't have a lot of detailed records about how these people were actually paid. I showed an example of a hospital contingent bill where the money was recorded in British currency at the time, pounds, shillings, and pence. I don't know how the people were paid. The impression I have is that they're paid in local currency, or no, not in local currency, in local specie, hard money, coins. And because the coins are made out of precious metal, it doesn't matter what nation's coin they are, they have value. In those rare cases where we find people talking about what money they had or lost, we find, say, a case of someone saying, well, my purse was stolen, and in it were 2 Portuguese half-jocanas, gold guinea, and 5 pence, and $2. You get this weird amalgamation of coins from different realms all being used together. So no uniform system is where I'm going with it. And again, determining how much a woman can actually earn is really, really, really hard to do. Okay, I'm going to sweep over this way now. This way.
What were the restrictions on soldiers bringing their wives with them? So everybody
Okay, what were the limits on soldiers bringing their wives with them? I am going to throw in a little detail here is that I'm working on a book on this very subject about British soldiers' wives. It's going to get into a lot of this stuff. I have another talk we have to do for anybody who wants it that covers some of these things, but there's a myth and there's a reality. There's a myth that 6 women per company were allowed in the British regiment. The reason where that comes from is that when the British allocated quantities of ships to send regiments from Great Britain to America, they allocated enough shipping to carry 6 wives per company. That doesn't mean that's how many women actually came. It just means when we're doing all this math to figure out how many women are allowed, or how many people we need to put on the ships, we're going to use this as an allowance. So you'll hear this number 6 per company, and it's not fixed. The real answer is there is no fixed number of women allowed in the regiment, and very wide range. I said typically 500 men, and typically 60 to 80 wives. But I found cases of women in the regiment with double that number, or another one with half that number. And these are the wives that accompanied their soldiers. I know many women didn't come to America. Soldiers married in America as well. So there's a lot of variation. Company officers were supposed to give soldiers permission to get married for them, which shouldn't be a surprise to anybody who knows about the modern military, where when there's some sailor at a naval base in the Philippines who comes back to his officer and says, oh, I met the woman of my dreams, I want to get married now. The officer has some leave to restrict that kind of thing. How successful they were at restricting soldiers from getting married whenever they wanted is a very difficult question to answer. But we don't have any rule that says only this many wives are allowed to be with the army at any time. Let's go ahead and take this one first. Well, that's great question. Was the Army ever contracting non-married women, or they the only employ soldier wives? Again, a tricky question because it's very hard. There's a lot of cases where I can identify the woman, but I can't identify the husband. Most of the women I can identify are referred to as Mrs. This or Mrs. That, and sometimes in muster rolls I can correlate that name to a soldier's name. There is at least one woman, this was in the French and Indian War, a woman who was a matron to the hospital, who was known to have been not married to a soldier. I don't know if she was married at all, was in fact the matron to the Army hospital. So it seems that there were cases where non-married women were with the Army. I talked about the widows too. There are a number of cases of widows who remained with the Army even after their husbands died. But in terms of never having had a connection to a soldier, I can't say that I'm sure about that either way. Sorry for the vague answer. Sadly, that's the nature of the information we have to deal with on this subject. Vague. There was a question here in the front.
Prostitution, I don't know whether
Was there prostitution around the military camps? The answer is yes. However, everything I deal with when I'm working with this is I'm talking about British soldiers' wives. I'm not talking about people who lived in the town where the Army happened to be. So was there prostitution? Oh, I'm sure there was, but that's not part of where my studies go, because I'm looking at the soldiers and their wives. So, other questions? All right, thank you all very much.
So our next presentation is Infantry in Battle in the 18th Century with Dr. Alexander Burns. So Alexander Burns is an assistant professor of history at Franciscan University in Steubenville. His research focuses on the Atlantic world, the American Continental Army, and military Europe. Alex's first major publication, The Changing Face of Old Regime Warfare, is edited best shrift. For his mentor, Christopher Duffy. Of course, many of you have read his book, The Military Experience of the Ancient Crazy. His first authored book, Infantry in Battle, 1733 to 1783, shows how 18th century common soldiers fought with surprising complexity of ways. His next book project, Firm Battalions and American Fire, the Continental Army and Military Europe, explores European influence on tactical practices George Washington's Continental Army. He also runs an excellent blog called Cabinet Creed, which I think many of you may know him by. I probably pronounced that wrong too. Which focuses on warfare in the 17th and 18th centuries. So, Alex Burns.
Thanks so much, Jim. It's great to be here with you all. This is, as Jim noted, I'm a professor at a small Catholic college in Ohio. This year is the 10th anniversary of my time as a reenactor, a decision I've never fully financially recovered from. So I look forward to sharing with you a little bit today about my research, and I'm grateful for the invitation to be here. My colleague Robert Boyle at Franciscan says I'm a bit of a spaz. I walk around when I teach, so I hope you won't mind if I do that here today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background of revolutionary war era tactics. Primarily, we're going to be looking at experienced soldiers fighting in Europe, what the tactical norms were over there, maybe a new model of those norms. And then later on, Alex, Kane, and Jared, and Jim, and Sean are going to tell you a little bit about the specific fighting in Europe. But I think even just looking at what's going on in Europe, maybe it's a little bit more flexible, a little bit more adaptable than we might initially imagine. I first want to talk about the idea that 18th century warriors or soldiers in lace, or the idea that their uniforms are not terribly conducive to fighting in Thank you so much. And to do that, I want to have Tyler and set foot over here stand up, in addition to the gentleman who's on the slide. And nothing against Tyler, but looking at this from modern eyes, not our perspective as reenactors, but maybe the perspective of the public running to a uniform like this, it can be hard for, when I teach ROTC cadets at my university, for them to take a uniform like this seriously, a uniform like this seriously. How can we take seriously soldiers who are wearing brightly colored clothing, who are wearing, cocked hats or lace on their uniforms? Often the misconception is they're wearing powdered wigs, but really often they're powdering their own hair and wearing it long. And so this is something, thank you so much, Tyler, that we have to kind of struggle against. And really, I think, drive home to the public, me to my students, that soldiers like Tyler are serious and dangerous fighters in the 18th century. And they were engaged in military art in a way that was cutting edge for their time. So let's look a little bit at incredible. So this is it comes as any surprise to you, those of you who've been tortured by the Patriot, seeing the stereotypical Hollywood version of 18th century battle. And I didn't select films or GIFs from the Patriot there. This is actually a Russian movie called The Sovereign Servant that depicts the Battle of Poltava in 1709. But you all are familiar with stereotypes. Okay? The 18th century soldiers march slowly to the beating of drums. They march in close range, very close range, and sometimes in reenactments, I think we're guilty of doing this. Exchanging fire when troops are 25 yards apart or something like this. They obey their officers' commands, almost like robots. I mean, if you watch the troops in the future advancing, like stares over their faces, right? An automatic obedience, I think, has become. Exchanging fire by trading volleys. This is common from films set in our period. It's common in depictions of Napoleonic warfare. You kind of take turns firing back and forth in volleys in the Hollywood version. You don't take cover. You stand there and you get shot. You can see some of the poor Swedish soldiers getting shot by the Russians there in that clip. Then finally, and I find Outlanders particularly guilty of this, there's a mutual charge in a hand-to-hand combat. The whole thing wraps up with Mel Gibson or whoever it is killing people with hatchets. And so I want to take us through, in the course of the talk today, a little bit more realistic version of this. A version of this that looks at what 18th century soldiers themselves had to say about their experience of battle. It's not just Hollywood that gets this wrong. Frequently, professional historians, people like me, are equally guilty with Hollywood in leading the public astray. You read general histories of the 18th century. The idea that only robotic discipline could wield an 18th century army together. That ordinary soldiers, particularly the soldiers that I spend most of my time studying, Prussian soldiers of Frederick II or Frederick the Great, how are they described? Automata welded to their muskets. Machines for whom individual marksmanship was irrelevant. It doesn't seem like, a very modern view of an 18th century army. These soldiers are wearing brightly colored clothing. They don't bother to aim their weapons. How seriously can we take these soldiers? And perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of this is fairly outdated. One of my mentors, you can see him there in the lower right of the slide, Christopher Duffy. This is him at the conference South Bend. He's an absolute ham. He's passed now. He would show up at academic conferences dressed like this. He is responsible for starting to change some of our perceptions of 18th century warfare, trying to make us look at these soldiers not just as like a decorative interval in military history, but as actual serious men who engage in a deadly business of fighting. And there are many others that have sort of come after him. I'm sure you're familiar with some of the names listed there below, especially the British Army. Matthew Spring, we'll talk about him a little bit at the end of the lecture. In the world that, again, I most commonly inhabited over in continental Europe, people like Sasha Nubius and Billy Brokovich have really retooled the story of 18th century common soldiers. What motivated them to fight, what their experiences were like on the battlefield. This is really the core of what makes me tick, trying to get into the heads of these men and trying to understand 18th century soldiers on their own terms. Okay. So, I want to read you a description of a battle that maybe as Americans we're not very familiar with. This is the Battle of Wassel in 1734, and we have essentially an Irishman fighting in a German army, the Austrian Imperial Army, and he describes what the combat at that battle looks like from the perspective of actually being there on the ground, seeing the fighting firsthand. They march slowly up to the enemy, and the officers are ordering the men, don't fire, don't fire. If you read George Washington's orders again and again, he says, don't fire too long range. By the time you get to 1777, he says things like, don't fire on long range under pain of death. Don't waste your fire at 100 yards or more. But for the ordinary soldiers, that can be a really hard task to execute. And so frequently, these men will fire at very long ranges. And you can see here in this quote, what happens? Well, an individual soldier, the grenadier, fires, and the other soldiers follow his example. And so as opposed to marching in at close range, maybe attacking the enemy with bayonets, a firefight develops. And the battle doesn't go away, the officers keep going. Instead, they waste a lot of ammunition, they don't do much damage to the enemy, and the officers are very frustrated. He says again and again, well, I'm hitting the men with the flat of my sword, Prince Louis of Württemberg is hitting his men with the flat of the sword. It's a very antagonistic relationship in some ways between these 18th century soldiers and their officers. And so, in the course of my dissertation research, in the archives over Europe and archives here in America, reading letters like this again and again, I started to try and identify what I thought were the key features of 18th century warfare from the perspective of these men who took part. And so, as opposed to being robots who would simply do whatever their officers commanded, these men thought about whether or not to follow orders. They thought about whether or not to fire at maybe a greater distance than their officers wanted. The accounts of soldiers ripping their muskets from the shoulder and opening fire at a greater range are ubiquitous throughout these archived documents in the 18th centuries. Likewise, they frequently aim their muskets at the enemy. They're not just sort of firing blindly, they're not robots or, the quote from Manuel Belanda, individual markers here is irrelevant. These are men who take aim. And frequently, again, maybe the public will hear, well, muskets in the 18th century don't have sights. Well, the musket, British musket may not have a great sight. The bayonet butt is the sight. But if you go into the back room here, and you see the Charlotte that's in the display case, it has a front sight on the end. And a lot of 18th century muskets do. Alan has written about how soldiers would fire back sights into their muskets. So just because they don't have great sights doesn't mean they aren't always aiming. They fight skirmishers, firing at will, without waiting for words of command, frequently firing by volleys or engaged in alternative fire, like platoon fire. That doesn't really happen very often. They're firing at longer ranges that are making George Washington tear his hair out at times. Frequently they run on the battlefield. They're not marching slowly, robotically, and Matthew Spring's written a lot about this in related reference to the British Army, so I won't get too much into it now. They take cover. And above all, they don't like fighting in melee. It's a really difficult task to run up to someone and stab an 18-inch long bayonet into them. And so psychologically, it's a lot easier to fire at a longer range. Men prefer to fight like this when they can. All right, let's go through these in a little bit more detail. First of all, aiming. Sometimes my undergraduate students, maybe you remember I teach in a small town called Steubenville. I can't guess who the mascot is at my university. The myth is Steuben comes over and trains us to aim. Take aim is in the regulations, right? And so before then, supposedly, the myth goes, European soldiers didn't aim. And if there's an army in the 18th century that is really guilty of being kind of robotic in how it fights, I would say it is the Prussian army. But right here, in the Prussian infantry regulations from 1750, you have the king of Prussia, Frederick II, writing, the officers have to make sure that men are aiming carefully, looking fully into their fire. when they're taking aim, they're dropping their heads a little so they can carefully see their target. This is nothing new, really. If the command present or level doesn't mean that soldiers aren't individually taking aim. It's a different word, it's not take aim, but it does not mean that common soldiers were not expected to aim on the battlefield. Likewise, of course, in a place like Boston, you all know, I'm sure, the soldiers engaged in target practice. Shooting at marks is a really common practice in the 18th century. Frederick Mackenzie in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers describes shooting at targets out in Boston Harbor that are on buoys, kind of moving up and down in the water. So it's very easy to learn how to lead a moving target for these men who are shooting at marks, practicing the marksmanship. These are orders from General Riedesel, transmitting stuff from Governor Carleton up in Canada. Each company is designing a target of their own, and I didn't reproduce the whole quote, but essentially the best few shots in each company of men get a cash prize. So individual marksmanship is absolutely prized, not just by the Americans, but by most 18th century European armies. These men are aiming at their targets, or at least they're taught to do so. I think in some ways this is the core of what I add to the literature in my book. That idea of trading volleys back and forth. One side fires, then you load, the other side fires. Frequently, fire control breaks down on these battlefields. And officers lament. This is Johann Gottfried Bleuer, a German officer from the late 18th century. He says, "It's a shame we couldn't build what he calls an unfeeling shooting machine." In that crazy way of thinking about it. We couldn't build a robotic soldier. And so instead of this, what we find is that soldiers engage in what Hoyer calls Plackerfeuer, which is essentially, as soon as the men have loaded their guns, not waiting for the words of command, they're opening fire on the enemy as fast as they possibly can. This is really how 18th century battle was fought. All 18th century armies, George Washington's words of the day, complain about this incessantly. The soldiers don't wait for the words of command. They fire without orders. It's a very, very common problem from the perspective of officers. Now, those of you who maybe have delved a little bit more into 18th century tactics know that there are very complex systems of alternate fire in the 18th century. These are linear battles with battalions of 400 men stretching for perhaps 500 feet across an open space. They are trained to always have a reserve of muskets when they fire. That only perhaps an eighth, or at the very least a third of the men would ever be firing at once. So if you're attacked, say by enemy cavalry, you always have a reserve of loaded muskets to protect yourself. This is the ideal. This is what 18th century officers would like to see. If you read a lot of military treatises, this is what they focus on. But if you see these quotes from the War of Austrian Succession as they're describing what actually happens in battle, and in a court-martial, one British officer says, the fire of our foot was infamous. And it's almost like he's on car talk, or at the mechanic describing what he's hearing. Puff, puff. They were better to fire as fast as they possibly could. They weren't platoon fire. Likewise, at the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745, more senior British officers kind of riding the lines on his battalion, and a battalion grade officer turns to him and says, well, how should we engage the enemy? Should we fire by platoons? Should we fire by ranks? What should we do? And the more experienced senior officer kind of looks at him and says, well, I'd be happy if you could do either, but I've never seen that happen except in raw reviews. So he's kind of acknowledging that these more complex systems of alternate fire, that's something we can practice. That's not something that actually happens much in the actual battlefield. It's a very famous quote used by Duffy and others. I bring in these kind of segues, the 2 points that we have here. First of all, the men in this description of Battle of Dettingen, they're fired individually. This is what Boyer would call pocket fire, for loading the fire as fast as possible. But second, he notes that they're also stooping down, dropping down, trying to make themselves as small a target as possible, and then after the enemy fires past over, they're standing back up to fire themselves. And so you do see frequently, even all the way back here in Europe, again, this isn't Mel Gibson and company doing this. This is these European soldiers that are supposedly so rigid, engaged in alternate systems of firing and taking cover on the battlefield, not just standing there waiting to get shot. These are men who realize their lives are at stake and throwing themselves to the ground when they are faced with deadly enemy fire. And so you see comments like this one from Thomas Andrew. In combat, all the manual exercise, he says, is but in words. All the complicated things that we do on the drill square, he says, we're out the window in actual combat. And this is a common sentiment, I think, in 20th century war, even the 19th century war. It's happening here in the 18th century as well. What really matters is charging your piece, loading your muskets, charging with bayonets, attacking, intimidating the enemy, trying to drive them off the battlefield. This is the core of what it means to be a soldier in the 18th century. He also here describes the process of tack loading. You know what that is, or he's ready to go through that. So essentially, you're dumping the powder down the barrel and ramming, tapping on the ground. It's not great for your musket. I wouldn't recommend this. I got like I guess my musket turns like 75 this year. I have Japanese Moroccan. But this is a very common practice here in North America. Over in Europe, it's endemic. And the Austrians do this a lot to try to keep up with the Russians and their superior rate of fire. Again, maybe combat looks a little bit different than the first one. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about taking cover on the battlefield. All throughout the battles that I begin my book in the 1730s, something we don't really talk about very much. The War of Polish Succession. It's not a very common war for us to think about, especially here in America. To some extent because the Redcoats are involved, British are involved. And so it's not really part of our national experience. But this is where a lot of those ideas come from. This War of Polish Succession is the first large war in the mid-18th century. And so the ideas that begin there, I think, chart, at least in infantry warfare, all the way through the 18th century. These soldiers, essentially crawling, I can include this quote with another German officer named Garnery. Garnery says they crawl on their bellies in after the manner of Croats here in Parma and Wisla, so they're on the ground, taking fire. In the modern military context, we say going prone to avoid enemy fire. This is stuff that happens even over here in Europe. And obviously, as we study the tactics of the American Revolution in great detail, know that this kind of thing is happening in our revolution as well. It's an interesting comment from a Scottish soldier describing the regiment that will eventually become the Black Watch, the 42nd Highlanders, fighting in a very particular style. That is to say, when they see the enemy getting ready to fight, they see the enemy getting ready to open up a volley, they'll throw themselves on the ground, let the fire pass over and spring back up. So you have men who are paying attention, seeing when the enemy's getting ready to fire, and trying to avoid that fire. This is something that infantry soldiers do a lot, especially when artillery is involved on the battlefield. And so, kind of a similar vein, Samson Staniford, which you all know, there's the 40th, so the 2nd Battalion Light Infantry at the Germantown region. He describes an incident at the Battle of Fontenoy where his regiment is coming up on the village, his battalion is coming up on the village, and they see a battery of heavy cannon. Artillery do most of the casualties in the 18th century, just like they do in more modern wars. Canister, especially over in Europe, kills more soldiers than any other type of projectile. And so in the face of this oncoming death, Samson Staniford says, when the officers say, yeah, get down. So the men throw themselves to the ground to try and avoid getting hit by canister shots from this French battery. Now, despite that, he notes it's not a foolproof solution. Men get killed even when you're trying to take cover. And so after this discharge passes over, the men rise back up, continue their advance, and he notes so continuing to keep up their own fire. Some other thoughts. Corporal Todd, British divers from 7 years ago in the French and Indian War, described an amphibious descent on the French coast. So they're on ships, almost like a D-Day situation of getting off the ships into rowboats, rowing into a French port. They then get out of the rowboats, they get onto the shore, and then they lie down on the beach so the naval artillery can fire over their own heads. So firing sort of getting small or laying down the battlefield, not just something that can preserve you from enemy fire, but perhaps friendly fire as well. Finally, you see here John Knox's description of a fight on the 47th. Again, we would engage in a firefight and we would lie down. So it's again, especially in the British Army, it's a very common tactical response all throughout the 18th century, from the 1740s on to why the American War we know so well here in the United States. And sort of on that point, fighting in the Caribbean with the 4th Regiment of Foot, not only are British soldiers ordered to lie down, they're ordered to sort of make small earthworks for themselves, build cover in front of themselves, almost like you might as we see in later Civil War battles in 1864 and 1865. Not only sort of making yourself a small target, trying to put something between yourself and the enemy. You don't have concealment, but you also have cover. And that brings us to the image that I started with, and those of you who bought my book this morning, you notice the cover of my book as well. It's Xavier Delgado's image of the Battle of Germantown. This is not an image that's greatly beloved by the museum folks there at the Chew House in Philadelphia today. They don't like the image because if you look at it, it doesn't look much like the Chew House. The image that the building that Xavier Delgado paints doesn't look a lot like the Chew House. And they're not wrong with that. It looks like an Italian house. He's an Italian artist. But specifically, in my book, I kind of give my own hypothesis on why the building looks the way it does. If you look at the way he paints the Chew House, it looks very similar to casina stone buildings that troops took cover in during the War of Polish Succession. And some of the best battle painters at that point in the 18th century, people like Hyacinth Pena, in the sort of court museum in Torino today in Italy, you can see some of his paintings of those battlefields. This image, troops being inside this building, the building's almost a carbon copy of those paintings. So I think to some extent, Xavier Delgado is like, well, I got troops going into a building, I'll do what I know, I'll use this painting as an example, that's kind of let's go with one here. There are a lot of other wonderful details I'm not going to get into in the interest of time, but particularly the men of the light infantry sort of fired on the fence line there. We know from General Sullivan's descriptions of the Battle of Germantown, they're fighting from every fence, from every stone wall. This is one of the reasons why it's so difficult for the Americans to dislodge the British as they're fighting their way through the village of Germantown. Okay, good. That's taken care of. Moving on a little bit, let's talk about running on the battlefield, moving at greater speed than we normally think of 18th century soldiers. Now, those of you who've read Matt Spring's Concealed Bandits Only, this should come as no surprise. But even in other European armies fighting in Europe, we see men moving at a greater speed on the battlefield. We see men describing things like how were they moving? They were running as in a race in the battles of the War of Polish Succession, trying to get to the endangered part of the battlefield as fast as possible. At the Battle of Prague in 1757, the fight between the Prussians and the Austrians, we see a comment from a Fusilier regiment where they say, we were supposed to arrive at this part of the line at a particular moment, but we got stuck behind some fish ponds, a dam. And so as a result, we had to run in order to get to the right spot of the battle line at the right time. Notice kind of sheepishly, he says, the regiment was not in perfect order. This is an officer saying this, he would like the regiment to be firmly under control. You see almost that exact language described from Lieutenant Du Bois, the Battle of the Courthouse in the Malmosa regiment. You see, the regiment, we were moving quickly, the regiment wasn't exactly in order. So these officers are kind of acknowledging this is the reality. Maybe it doesn't look exactly like the drill square. We're doing the best we can. Johann Jakob Dominikus, a Prussian musketeer of the 9th Regiment of Frederick's army, describes the Battle of Königsberg in 1759 and says, we were targeted by enemy artillery. And so what's the response? We have to run with energy in order to get out of the line of fire and sort of get under the enemy guns where they can't target us. So again, these are Prussians. These were the supposed ideal robotic troops in the 18th century. They're running on the battlefield to avoid being shot by things like canister. I think it's a very natural response from both the officers and the men. Okay. Now, Another point that I'll kind of close with here, or move directly into the American War of Independence, is soldiers respond to the shock and stress of battle in really modern ways that we would probably look at today, or not we, but psychologists would look at today and say, maybe this looks like a little bit like PTSD. The soldiers from the same village who know each other for years in the Prussian army would see their friends and relatives in the military killed right in front of them. A letter from the Battle of Prague in 1757 describes how there was a man of the regiment who author knew, his name was Crumples, was hit by a round shot. Essentially, it destroyed his face. His brains flew into the author's face. I mean, this is stuff that really leaves a lasting impact. German soldiers describe a phenomenon in the 7 Years' War they call cannoned fever, like literal translation of cannon fever. But basically, we would say it's like freezing after a battle, not being able to move because you are sort of replaying the images that you've seen on the battlefield in your mind. Again, I'm not a psychologist. I can't say this is PTSD, but there are certainly similar phenomena that soldiers in the 18th century deal with as a result of the seriousness of these battles. Okay. So, as a result, in my book, which I don't have any copies left, sorry, I didn't have much room in my carry-on luggage, there are kind of postulating a new model of 18th century combat, particularly in Europe, particularly in the middle of the century. That instead of behaving like robots, soldiers are aiming at weapons, they're running the battlefield, taking cover, firing using their own judgment. In many ways, this combat looks a little bit more modern, a little bit more recognizable. Looks a little bit more like the fighting that our soldiers in World Infantry combat experience today than the Hollywood version that frequently the public is subjected to in film. Okay, good. Now, I don't want to steal Jared and everyone else's thunder, but I do briefly want to say just a couple of words on how the British Army is even more unique in the context of the 18th century, looking at Matt Spring's incredible quote from Symposium. So the British Army, I would say, all 18th century European armies are doing this to some extent or another. The British Army is doing it more than others. They are focused more on getting to the enemy quickly. So this is an important distinction. They're trying to quickly close the distance, get into relatively close range, so the enemy will withdraw without a long firefight developing. They're operating in open order as they're doing this. This is pretty standard across the various armies, and there are folks who would say it's not as true in the conventional army or the Saratoga army as other British armies, and I don't know that I really will comment on that. But I will say, especially in the South, especially in the Philadelphia campaign, this style of fighting is really marks the British Army. Sets them up. They're very dangerous and flexible fighting force. People, especially my graduate students, would go, the best army in the world? Probably not. Probably it's the Russians. The Russians were the best army in the world still. Certainly the British are one of the best funded armies in the world. But they are a very capable force. That's one of the reasons why it's so hard for Washington to score tactical victories over the British in the course of the Revolution, even when American forces outnumber the British by a significant margin. Again, if you've not read it, hopefully you all have. Check out Matt Spring's New Zealand Amendments article. It completely reshape how you think about the British Army in the 18th century. What about North America makes this situation possible? Well, to a large extent, you can say it's the lack of heavy cavalry that's so present in Europe. You don't have a regiment of cuirassiers or heavy soldiers with armor, like you can see a 17th century example of there over the case, ready to ride you down. So as a result, you can open up the files a bit more. You can operate a bit more flexibly and fight a little bit more like light infantry. And this, you can get away with this as much because there's not. The debate is, did the Americans do this too? You're going to have to wait for me to finish my next book. It will really come out and on definitively on that question. I will say I've been reading some pension applications from soldiers in South Carolina in the later part of the war, even militia. They do say we're operating in open order with trailing arms, so similar to the British gentlemen in the I skipped over John Lewis. I was going to point him out as I'm But, okay, so I think that's probably about where I'll leave it. Just going to be a few more thoughts here. The British, unlike a lot of 18th century armies, are trying to scare the enemy as they're going into combat. They're cheering, they're shouting, they're sort of giving a halloo to the enemy as they're coming in. It's designed to intimidate the American forces, get them to withdraw off the battlefield, take cover, and form an open order. And I think two quotes really encapsulate in my mind just how flexible the British are and why they're doing what they're doing. And these quotes come from a German officer, a Braunschweiger officer, Freiherr Wiedesel. So I'm just real fast here, this is how I'll end. I want to walk through these two quotes describing the skirmish, the end of the Canadian campaign in 1776. This brigadier, obviously, the British general, went to meet the rebels on the road to Montreal, came across the Helm, he halted, gave orders for one of the English regiments to lie down, and in this position, sent one well-placed volley after another at the enemy. I always comment to my undergraduate students who are in the war, sort of Mel Gibson-oriented view of the American Revolution. It's like they're, the patriots at this point, right? They're the ones in ambush, they're the ones taking cover. It was all the more successful because it was in a dense forest when they met the rebel column. The enemy took flight with the utmost confusion and its unexpected fire and hastened back to the water. But I think really, from my perspective, this is more of a mid-18th century historian. The key part of this quote is what comes next. He says, why do they do this? Why are we not necessarily fighting in ways that are quite as flexible as the British are? It's the experience of the French and Indian War. It's the experience that they had like fighting against the French in the 1750s, and maybe some of the setbacks they suffered in places like Monongahela and even in Carrier. The English make it one of their chief rules and principles in this country, that's North America, that no maneuvers may ever be carried out in the second ranks in these districts that are so terribly rude. They found that out to the cost in the last war against the French in North America, in which they were always unsuccessful in the commencement, until they taught their men to maneuver within the ranks, cover themselves by means of trees, which they were always successful. 18th century soldiers, always obeying their officers. They're thinking, and how am I going to be able to fight this battle and wage the best chance of surviving? Maybe even the officers as well, a little bit more flexible, especially the good ones. Thank you so much for your time. More questions? Yes, ma'am. So there is at least one example that I've come across of fragging in the 18th century. And if you want, I can talk to you in greater detail after the lecture and give you that reference. It's in Christopher Duffy's Military Experience Game of Reason. Yeah, I'm sorry. So the question is, one, is there dehumanization in 18th century armies? Or are they kind of like othering the enemy, hating their opponents to an inhuman degree? Second, there would be examples of fragging, killing your own officers in the 18th century. And answering the second one first. So yeah, I'd say there are examples of fragging. A British officer in one of the battles in the War of Spanish Succession, I can't remember which off the top of my head. He's not liked by his men, and they're on the battlefield, and he turns around to give an order, and someone shoots him in the head. And they don't know exactly who shot him, maybe they're not too keen to find out. So I do think fragging can happen in the 18th century context, even if it's not as common as it was in Vietnam, or at least as common as stereotypically was thought of in Vietnam. So to answer the first part, yeah, I do think there's some hatreds that develop among these armies. Certainly, if there are hatreds that develop in long-standing. One is the Prussians hate the Austrians. The Austrians hate the Prussians right back. The British and the French, are thinking about each other in ways that I'm not sure is quite dehumanization, but is maybe pushing towards more nationalistic ideas in the 19th century. And especially when there's fighting against Native Americans, I would say there you see language that comes closer to dehumanization. And I'm going to give you a quote from, I think, General Forbes in 1758 during the French and Indian War. It's fairly racially charged, I apologize for this. But he says in a letter, I think, to Washington, about training British troops to fight in this manner, a little bit more like Native Americans. He says it would be easier to make Indians of our white men than to use that damned white race. So again, it's the 18th century world. Dehumanization is present to some degree. When German soldiers come to America, they're constantly comparing Native Americans to the experiences they've had in Eastern Europe and Cossack raids and things like this. So you do see a centralization. You do see maybe to some extent dehumanization. Other questions you all have? Yes, sir.
So the changes from free rank science in the 70s, but then Roche Bow on the way forward changes how they eliminates the first line. How often do you see that happening, and what sort of changes in European science happening for the Americans?
That's a really good question. So I'd say the main one is you open up the files. And this is a conversation that I'm most familiar with in the context of Hessians and Symposium movement. Some Hessian groups, like the Braunschweigers, they will actually do what the British do and open up the files to 22 ranks. Others, like the Hessians, they say, no, we're going to keep the three-rank formation or keep the two-rank formation in close order, but we're going to have skirmishers out in front of the battalion. And I gave a talk with Bellon, actually, last year at the site in Cincinnati. If you want to find it online, I have a talk. We're basically describing this process of the Hessians using skirmishers as a way to not do exactly what the British are doing. And it's fairly effective in the war campaign. Now, over in Europe, this stuff is in these ordinances and regulations, but it also is very much dependent on the needs of the commander of the moment. So in the Prussian army in the 7 Years' War, in the middle years of that war, when the Prussians were really struggling and running low on manpower, they adopted two-rank law. Not because they necessarily want to, tactically, because they don't have enough men to have battalions be as long as they need to be with a three-rank line. And a battle I've written about for Birmingham University Press, the Battle of Strela in 1760, General Hulsen there is defending the breastwork. He doesn't have any troops. He reduces it down to a one-rank. So certainly it's in the ordinances and it's in the regulations, and probably in an ideal world they do follow those very closely, but it also individual commanders have the authority they need on the spot to kind of add and reduce ranks if necessary. So I would say that's something. What other questions? Yes? Sure. Probably my university would like me to say Christ-like love and charity. But sometimes it can be frustrating. Sometimes it can be, we hear that every semester when I hear my students have the same misconceptions again and again. I think we have to remember, like, whether it's in a professional or volunteer context or just something we really love, we're doing this for fun, right? We're doing this as a way to educate the public. And so I'm terminally online, it tells me. I'm always on Twitter. And so I took a Twitter poll of, some common ideas about how the revolution was fought a few weeks ago. And I put that in the Progressive Revolutionary Facebook group, so we were on there. And I got the very good feedback. I don't know from people we shouldn't necessarily expect the public to have a detailed level of knowledge about revolutionary tactics. And maybe if they're out at a reenactment, that's a good opportunity for us to have that conversation again and again. I will also say, and this is what I said back to the nice lady who's still giving me this feedback. A lot of people have an uncle or a grandfather or a nephew who's really into military history. And so if that's going to be the case, I think it's our duty to try and ensure that they are into that military history in the most accurate way possible. And so keeping these things in mind, trying to not necessarily engage someone in every single question, particularly if they're kind of more set in their ways. I point them to things to read. I'd say, have you read Military History in the Age of Reason? Have you read Matthew Springs with Zero Bayonets Only? These are ways that they can educate themselves further, and you don't necessarily have to spend 15, 20 minutes in a conversation to explain tactical ideas that they get a broader sense of at times. Any other questions? You all have? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned in your Hollywood vision that the coding battle to the drum.
Yes.
Was that, my understanding was that was a way of spreading finance.
Yeah. So it depends on which army we're talking about. But I would say in Europe, in the middle of the 18th century, it's relatively uncommon for drums to be keeping cadence. They do that a lot in training. They don't always do that on the battlefield. So sometimes you'll see descriptions of soldiers who are being taught to march. They're being a drum beat. But very rarely in actual combat do you see descriptions of men drumming to keep them at cadence. Because, again, I think this is the heresy, but they don't probably keep cadence, especially if they're marching through difficult terrain, under fire. I mean, a lot of that stuff goes out the window. They're trying to move very quickly if they're under fire. So I'd say that in response, frequently, and I talked about this a bit in the book, I didn't have these quotes on the slides, but frequently what drummers do on the battlefield is they reverse, at least in the Austrian Russian armies, they reverse their drums and use those drums as like a way to carry ammunition or ammunition. So the descriptions of the Austrian army in the battle of Napoleon, I think it's correct. That essentially they have tumbrils like ammunition carts behind the lines. The drummers are running to those carts, putting as many paper cartridges in the drums so they can lift, and then carrying that back to the fire. So I would say that's probably more on the realm of what drummers are doing in battle as opposed to fire. Yes, ma'am. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the opening stages of battle, where you're not, maybe you're under round shot artillery fire at 500 yards or more, you're really close. That's probably the case. Once you actually get into battle, it's very difficult to hear the drums over those under fire. And so sometimes you can see horns being used, like a variety of ways to try and communicate commands in the midst of combat. And sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not. The generals and senior officers don't really have the idea until Frederick the Great gets back after the Battle of Zorndorf to his tent in 1758. And he's talking to one of his friends, who's basically like a poet who was there in the army. He's like, "Well, did you understand what was going on?" And he was like, "Well, I mentioned the first part of the battlefield, kind of where everyone was lining up, and then there was a lot of smoke. I didn't really have any idea what was happening." And Frederick the Great, who's considered one of the best generals in the 18th century, turns to the other guy and says, "Oh, you're not the only one." So there's a sense that you use these tools very effectively, especially flags, right? The regimental flags are vital for keeping unit kind of on trajectory in combat. You use these a lot in battle open. Once the shooting starts, it's kind of a lot of the parade round stuff goes out the window. There's a comment from a Prussian officer who says, once the shooting starts, basically at that point as officers, we're waiting for the mass to either go forward or go back. There's not a lot of control over the officers. And I think that's probably a better sense. If you're in a heavy firefight, you can be beating on the drum. Any other questions? Yes? Okay, that's a really good question. So I would say 3 rounds of ammo is pretty standard, even across the Prussian. You hear that they fire 6 or 7 or 8 times a minute, especially after they have like the common touch holds or the Nemrod. But if you actually read descriptive sources, not prescriptive sources, that say, oh, we can on the parade ground fire 8 rounds a minute. But descriptive sources of what happens in battle, usually it's 3 or 4 rounds a minute. In the Austrian case, it's 2 or 3. Duportal, a French engineering officer who's with Washington at Valley Forge, is basically doing like napkin math. How much ammo do we need? And he says, well, if the British attack Valley Forge, we can assume men will be firing at a rate of 3 rounds a minute. So I think that's a pretty good average for 18th century armies as far as what they're actually doing. I think, one more question, if there's another question. Yes, I'm sorry.
That question is mine.
Sure.
A lot of complaints that I spoke to from those managers out of the control issues. But one thing I wonder about is the car is a great fire. If you got 100 men, and you're really getting that actually one person is but if it's a regular fire, or it's constantly fire, that means it's 5 shots every second.
Sure.
Which is more efficient? 5 shots every second, or 100 shots in 20 seconds?
Yeah,
So it seems to me that psychologically, 5 shots per second has its effect.
Sure.
Because there's no movement during which you can attack the enemy. But 100 shots at one time is also a fire. That's a psychological effect itself. So you have the commander saying, once we were this throughout history, the troops have not complied and it's a regular fire. We know that regular fire is more efficient. That's how the troops should.
So here's what I'll say. There are debates about this not just in this period, but all the way back to 30 years of war conflicts. And my best understanding is, and actually it's on the video game right now, and I have this fight developed. Individual fire, even in the 17th century, the men floating and firing as fast as possible, officers tend to think that's a little more important than ever fire bullets. So maybe it doesn't. But a volley of shots, fire 100, 200, 300 men, the whole plane's firing, 500 men firing at one time, that doesn't keep morale, that shock to the enemy, especially if it's a little bit closer range. This is Gustavus Adolphus in 30 years ago. Is the other armies at the time basically all been independent firings, and we're all in fire units. And that doesn't deliver a powerful round shot. Probably more intense than a slow sputter. A sputter of fire or a regular fire that's delivered over the same span. So one, the men could take their aim target, they pick out what they're shooting at, they don't have to think, because the officer would be shot, they would be able to fire. But on the other hand, maybe you're not doing as much morale. I'll just close with this. Washington in 1777 is written a letter by General Alexander Duke, Brigadier General Alexander Duke. And in this letter, Duke says, well, essentially there are 2 problems. The American soldiers are great shots because essentially they're used to firearms. But they're not used to the noise of the battalion called firing bullets. It's very intimidating for them. Whereas the soldiers from Europe that are growing up on near these parade grounds are used to the more battalion. Maybe they're not as good at individual dexterity using them. And so I think you see kind of the conundrum there in that quote. Right? One might be accurate fire and actually hitting your target when you're shooting. Another perspective, you want the battle to be over as fast as possible. You want to deliver that shock to the morale of the enemy by the fire. What? To some extent, yeah, I would say. There probably are trade-offs here. In an ideal world, you would be firing in platoons and always have a reserve of loaded muskets in case the enemy is coming at you at close range, especially in camp. And so that's really where officers struck at with the current and they're finding pretty hard to okay. Yeah.
Just to set out. Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Very briefly, you mentioned casualty rates for
So there's 2 different things. Again, casualty rates, I would say, across the 18th century, my research looking at archival documents and other sources, on average, we're taking about 14% casualties, so not enormous. There are battles in the Battle of Zorndorf where the Russians take 50% casualties. So it's not a perfect guide. I would say on average, about 14%. As far as ammunition expenditure goes, it depends. You go into battle between 60 or more if you're Russians, and if you're like the Americans, 75, you have 10 rounds, right? So it depends on logistics. How many do you consume in battle? That's hard to say, because generally you end up getting more supplies from the train in the midst of battle. But with that said, both at Parliament and Host of Blood 1734, where I opened my work, and also the two battles I fought at the end of the Revolution, Germantown and Utah Springs. Fighting breaks off because the attackers are like that. And so when the enemy's in cover, like a house like we saw right there, the Chu house, and you're firing at them in cover, you're going to go through a lot of ammunition very quickly without much rounds. And so eventually that's going to mean you're black on ammo, you're out of ammunition. That happens to General Green, that happens to Generals 17. Thank you so much for your time. I really
That means Utah. All right, so now we're going to shift gears considerably, and we've gone from infantry and battle. Now we're going to be discussing farming and land use along the battle road in 1775, featuring Dr. Brian Donahue. Brian is a professor emerita of environmental studies and American studies at Brandeis University. His books include Reclaiming the Commons, Community Farms and Forests in the New England Town, and The Great Meadow, Farmers and the Land in Colonial Concord. This is standard reading for anyone interested in land use and colonial Concord. It was certainly an eye-opener for me. The first time I read it, I was like, I can't believe they let me out of the public before reading this. So I would like to welcome Brian Donahue.
Right, so this is from the Great Meadow book, and I did a lot of the work for that book while working for the National Park Service back in the early 1990s, in connection with putting in the Meadow Trail, which is kind of what I'm hired to do for this search. So I've been very dull as superintendent, and you remember it. So the book is, and then the book that you mentioned, The Great Meadow, that's 20 years old, so I'm trying to remember what this is all about. I'll do my best. There's two take-home messages that I'm going to be stressing as I look through this. And the first is that by 1775, obviously the Battle Road, Concord in general, was very densely settled and farmed by families who had been living there, many of them for 4 or 5 generations. And it was a very successful and sustainable way of living. It had its problems, which we can discuss, but the idea that they could just raise the land and move it, that did not stand up to the research I did pretty much in the Battle Road section of part that became a reservation. So that's the big take-home message here. All parts of the landscape were closely cultivated in one way or another, including woodlands in a way. What's that? Yeah, it's kind of a cavernous pit. So what we're going to do is we'll take a look at how the settlement took place along the Meadow Road through the first generations of white Concord settlement and just how the farming system worked. So that's the first take-home message. And the second one is though that by 1775 the land had not been ruined or degraded, but it was really at its capacity and under a lot of strain. Concord was full by then. It really could not hold very many more people, and these were still families that had like 6-8 kids on average. So only a couple of them could stay in town. For the first few generations, there were places for them to move out to the sea and start new farms from the original land. But by the end of the colonial period, the place was full, and so that it really was straining at the seams. So basically, everything in Rose's book and in their world really stands up. The land wasn't really being degraded, but it was really stretched to the capacity, I guess is the way I would put it. So that's kind of what I want to work us through. And please ask questions as we go. So anything you want me to expand upon or along those lines, but just shoot up your hand or whatever. Let's try to make a bit of a conversation. So I'm going to start with geology, superficial geology, and do this really quickly because I think it's hard making this all out with some of these slides. But so underlying Concord and the surround. Well, to begin with, that box is the original grant of Concord in 1635. It's about 6 miles, a little more than 6 miles on the side, and so since over time. Lincoln has been cut off and Bedford and Carlisle. And so to orient you, that's the acid bed river, and Sudbury, and Rock, and Merrimack, there's Walden, a sense of the place. And underlying it, all the soils around here is basically glacier. Pulled out 10,000 years ago, more than that, and it left 3 distinct kind of landforms of soils. To oversimplify, but to oversimplify in a way that the farmers, the English farmers of Concord, understood it. And they spoke about it in these terms, although they didn't know about the glacier. They really saw these 3 different kinds of land that they were dealing with. And the first, which is this kind of stuff, the upland, high upland parts, in that whatever color you would call that, is glacial till. That's actually underlying everything. That's the places where it's exposed on the hills and so forth. And that's what the glacier left mantles underneath it as it advanced. So it's packed over clay. It's got soil particles on all sides in it, from the very smallest to big rocks. So it's very, and they call these rocky lands, basically. And that's nutrient-wise, it's pretty decent soil, but it's obviously very hard to work. It's all mashed, boulder. And the second kind of soil, which is these tan stuff, is sand and gravel. Very sandy soils, that's what they call them, which was left by the glacial lakes that formed as the ice melted away to the north. The water kept getting pounded against the ice field, and it formed these glacial lakes, and so all the runoff and debris was swept into the lakes and was laid down in a degraded fashion. The sand and gravel soils. So those are all, the soils themselves are physically very well drained and very dry. Compared to the glacial till soils, which often have a hard pan at about 2 feet, so they're rotten, but they hold water. Some of the hills hold water better than others. But then the third kind is the really low soils, which are green here, that are alluvial soils along the rivers and so forth, that are fine silts, but they're very wet, and they call soils, like rocky soils, and sandy soils, and wet soils. And these were recognized by farmers as distinct landforms that farmed and used in different kinds of ways. They had to navigate their way with their farms through these different different capabilities of those. That's what I wanted to say about that. Oops, sorry about that, guys. Backwards. Go backwards. So there's a chapter in the book about the native landscape. I'm not going to speak about that here, other than to acknowledge its existence for 10,000 years or so before the whites arrived. Very complex, not well remembered or understood because of the diseases and so forth, and the impact of the Puritan settlement completely messing the society up. Yeah, I'm just not going to elaborate on that in this talk, except to say that it's apparently a very flexible, sustainable system that was utilized by Native people. They did not, of course, live in that box that became Concord, but went down the river. And of course, there are Native people today working on trying to understand again and revive elements of the system of land use that existed here for so long. All right, and then these will provide. So that's Concord during the first division. Concord was settled in 1635 by white farmers by about 50 families, as far as we know. And they were given a land grant by the great general court that was supposed to be 6 miles on the side. That's that diamond shape that you see. It's actually a little closer to 7 miles, as it worked out. And they divided the land among themselves. We're not sure exactly how, because the person who wrote the records from the town of Concord is missing since the 19th century. If anyone finds it, please let us know. So we start with the second book of the town records, which is in 1652, the second division. This was the first division of land that was done, and they left 3/4 of the land that were on the outside, as you can see, in commons. And then inside that, they granted themselves, 50 settlers or so, various kinds of lots. And the house lots, which you can see there, were all clustered around the center. 50 of them, usually about 5 or 10 acres. They had several large general fields that were around here. That was the Great Field, the Circumpolar Field, the South Field, and so forth, that were used for tillage. These were lands that the native people were probably using also in very sandy. Then they had meadowlands, and now meadowlands, if you hear, are the key to the system of agriculture. Concord was the first inland town settled in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and does anyone know why that was? And there were several others right about the same time, Dedham and Sudbury, Andover. Yes, sir. He was interested in which? He was certainly interested in trout, yeah. I'm not sure about salmon. Salmon are just... So that's disputed. You know, shad came up in great numbers. And there's been this huge debate for the last 50 years about whether there were also salmon as part of that migration. Times up in the air. But yeah, there were certainly resources out here that about salmon. Yeah, well, it's a highly disputed question among anthropologists about how many salmon are in the rivers of southern New York. Other attractions, though, of the rivers. Yeah.
I have a favor. If you try to speak a little bit louder, I'm really having a hard time hearing. And do you mind repeating the questions, because we definitely can't hear them.
Okay. So the question is, why was Concord one of the first inland settlements? Jim, go ahead.
All right, I'll take a crack at it. Follow up with it. Did it have to do with the meadows surrounding the rivers?
It totally had to do with the meadows. Yeah, they needed hay. They They desperately needed hay. They were livestock keeping people. Their cattle was the main livestock that they had, and then they had a tillage system that we'll talk about. But they needed winter hay, and they needed 6 months of it compared to a month or two in most of England. So as a result, along the coast, they had salt marshes. So it was all forest. The land was virtually 100% forested, very close to that. Some fields from the native people still on the landscape, but only a tiny percentage of the land. So mostly they had forests, and they had all these cattle, and they could turn them out in the woods in the summer, and so they slowly created pasture, but for the winter, they needed to cut hay. And the way we cut hay in England was on meadowlands along streams. And there was good native meadow along some of these streams, although it was mixed with brush and so forth. So the early inland towns was where they could get a big hay supply, basically. And that's why it was called the Great Meadow, and that's why there was a Great Meadow. Yes, sir.
Sorry, the town settlements, you can see the small plots of land. Are the fields held in common?
Great question. They were held in individual ownerships, but they were clustered, and we'll see some of that. And so those house lots, which were typically about 5 or 10 acres, were individually owned. And then all those settlers, and I'll show you an example in a minute, had pieces of land in some of the surrounding fields. So they had privately owned land, plots of 5 or 10 acres or whatever, like within the Great Field there, that had common fence around for many generations. And they had strips of meadow hay there in the Great Meadow, which is right there. So the hay was cut to feed the cattle through the winter, basically, and the manure from the hay was then carted out to be used on the tillage fields. That was the gist of the system from the get-go. They adapted an English kind of common field system to the New England landscape. Going back. Yes. So basically what they had was they had to reinvent an English mixed husbandry farming system in a new landscape, and in a landscape that was largely forested. So one of the things they had to do was find meadowland to feed their cattle through the winter, as I've just been talking about, and that was really key because the winters were so much longer here. They had to find summer pasturage for the livestock, and they had to have tillage land. They quickly adopted Indian corn. That's a really great grain for this part of the world. And squash and beans as well. They took those up from the native people. And they grew them in tillage lands within large general fields. So they had individually owned land within those big brown general fields that had one fence around the whole thing to keep the livestock out, but had individually owned fields. To grow a successful corn crop, you need manure. So they had to cart the manure out to those tillage plots that they had out in those places. And those were the main original pieces of land that they divided among themselves, and they kept 3/4 of the land in commons, everything that you see in white there, to be used in a regulated way to graze livestock in the summer and to cut firewood and timber to build houses and those kinds of resources. So that was all presumably managed by by the select board or some kind of committee, but we don't really know because we're missing the first book of records to get to extrapolate from other colonial towns. That system lasted for one generation, and in the 1650s, as the second generation came of age, the farmers in Concord divided the other 3/4 of the town that had been commons among themselves. It's called the second division, and I mapped all of it. That's the map of the first division. And we'll just look at one settler, to the extent that you can see that, named William Hartwell. He had a house lot there towards the east end of town. This is the beginning of the Battle Road here. So Hartwell had a house lot here. He had several plots of land, 5 acres or so each, in the great general field here. He had some mowing land in the great meadow. He had other pieces of mowing land out in other meadows, Rocky Meadow, by the Kiln Island, which is within the park there. He had one piece of tillage land out in the Kiln Field, which is inside the park. He had a piece of land up in something called the Chestnut Field up in Lincoln on what became Flint's Pond. It drove me crazy trying to figure out what the heck they were doing up there, because that is a very rocky, kind of swampy, wooded today piece of land that you could never run a plow over. I puzzled over this for a couple of decades, and finally figured out that they were growing chestnuts. There are still a few chestnuts up there, but there were chestnuts in the landscape, which were a great resource. So, in the second division, William Hartwell got some grants, and they're in green here, and there's one here, and that one is where the Hartwell Tavern is today, which was his grandson, Ephraim Hartwell, built that. So what they did was take all this area that had in common, and they chopped it up into little pieces and granted it to themselves at a ratio of about 3 to 1 to their original holdings in the person. It was a way to take all that great common resource and privatize it and make sure that there would be land for their next few generations of their offspring. And as you all know, they were having offspring at a tremendous pace. They were averaging 8 children for the first 4 or 5 generations. So they had a lot of land, they had a lot of demographic pressure to fill up land and find places for the kids to have similar farms. Yes?
Would those then be handled by physically dividing things, but just dividing your plot via stone walls and that?
Yes.
In like Salem, you could basically have a share of the common land that gave you the right to graze extra cattle or whatever on the meadows.
Yes, so this was a process in the second division. The question was, essentially, was the land enclosed when it was out in the commons and even when it was divided? And the answer is that when it was, like in the Great Meadow, which stayed the Great Meadow for many generations, that land was not enclosed. The different pieces within it didn't have fences between them. They had markers, so they kind of knew whose strip was whose when they went to mow the hay in August. But then later in the year, they opened the meadow up and they commonly grazed it with you could put in so many cattle depending on how much land they had in it. But this land that then got subdivided in the second division was completely privatized, and it was fenced or not fenced depending on how you're going to use it. And I think it could go on, but yeah. And so they put up rail fences, and gradually they built stone walls as they were pulling rocks and stones out of the land. You got a place for them, so they took them to the edge of the fields and built the walls. And the walls typically had a rail fence across the top of them, as such as is done at the same park. Yeah. Does that get at the?
Yes.
So this is they got land at a ratio of about 3 to 1, first division to second division land, and it gave them a patrimony to pass on to the children and grandchildren for them to have places to farm as they came of age. Usually, the youngest son and his wife ended up with the home place, and the older children who would come of age earlier got outlands to go settle and start to farm on, and then typically in each generation a couple of kids left town and went to the new towns that were being formed, like Acton was originally actually an additional grant. Tagged on and conquered, and it became its own town in 1735. form a new town. So there was this powerful process of demographic pressure, pumping out all these new farmers who were settling out to the edge of Concord, which took 3 or 4 generations, and also at the same time leaping out and starting new towns. And as each generation had to tackle the problem of breaking land out of the woods and creating tillage fields and pasture land and all the rest of it. And creating more and more meadow hay land, because that was the key driving resource of this whole system. You had to have enough hay for the cattle, and they didn't yet know about planting hay, such as we do today. Timothy and all that was not a skill they came from England with. That appeared in England in the 17th century after these people left. In England, all the hay came from low-lying meadows and long streams, and they imported the same system here. So what they were doing was taking all the wetlands in town, which is a quarter to a third of the town, and gradually transforming them into hay meadows to have enough hay for their stock. That was the driving engine of the whole system. And so most farmers had several plots of meadow in different meadows around town. In the Great Meadow along the river, but then along all these brooks, like up through the park, up through the Battle Road, there's all the wet areas along the brook there, gradually brought into cultivation. They had to be ditched and drained, and flooded in the winter to collect nutrients. It became quite an intricate system, but it took several generations to spread out and form town farms and settle the entire town. It's about 3 or 4 generations. So this sort of shows that. I'm going to show you a few examples within the park, and I'm going to be very impressionistic because there's no way to absorb the details, but this is the Merriam family, so now we're at Merriam Corner at the west end of the Battle Road section of the park. And John Merriam was a second-generation guy, and he had a house right at the corner, which disappeared sometime around 1800, and was found again when we were doing, Barbara Yokel and I were doing research on the Merriam house that was built by his son, the only one that still exists. We figured out that there had been an earlier house that was there at the time of the battle, and the archaeologists were able to find it as they were doing the trail. So they marked it. There's 4 little stones where the original Merriam house was, much closer to the road. And then you see in the next generation, so on the right, 3 of his sons took that same land, and there were other sons that moved off to Bedford, where Merriam had land. So John Jr. and Joseph and Ebenezer now had 3 houses on that same land, but they owned other land around town, which I will show you in a second. But it's really interesting the way these guys subdivided and mixed up all that land. These 3 guys worked very closely together. They were also blacksmiths, locksmiths there. And then in the next generation on the lower left, so we're up to the 4th generation of Concord, 3rd generation of the Merriams, and then they acquired some more land near their core there. And now there were 4 Merriam households. 3 sons of Joseph, who's the guy who built the Merriam house that's there now, and their uncle Ebenezer. Uncle Ebenezer married to be 102 years old. There were 5 wives. And then you can see the system kind of stabilizes. Not much change in the next generation. So let's take a broader look at those Merriams. Again, a little bit hard to absorb, but those 3 brothers that I was just speaking about in 1735, John and Ebenezer and Samuel, was it? They had 36 pieces of land in Concord, some out in Acton and so forth. Between them, these little 3 and 5 acre pieces, they had a whole bunch of land down in the Great Meadow where they cut hay, diamond shape. They had some more of the same thing out there in Old Brook Meadow. They had tillage land in the Great Field. Way up here at Flint's Pond, Sandy Pond, they had woodlands. And these are all like 5 and 10 acre pieces of land. So amazing. And these guys worked a lot, very closely together. They traded labor within the family and the neighbors and so forth. So you can see they're ordering the landscape and using different pieces of the land, and we'll talk about this in a minute, in different ways to support their system of husbandry, but it's not like they all have consolidated farms, especially those who live in close to the center. It's just the opposite. They've got pieces scattered all over the landscape on the right kind of land for that particular use. So the wetlands are converted to meadows, the sandy lands, if they're not too sandy, make good tillage for corn and rye, which they also grew. And then those rocky glacial till uplands are actually really good for woodlands and for pastures. If any of you are farmers around here, you know that in a really dry year, those rocky uplands hold water much better than some of the sandy road. They're still green in August when it hasn't rained, and these guys figured that out. And those were actually better for apple orchards as well. So they're kind of working their way onto the landscape over these first few generations. Let's look at a couple other families within the, come back. That's the Brooks family. No, I think I'm okay. If I get too stressed out, I'll have you do it for me. So that's the Brooks family, and so that's about a mile east of Marion. These different family clusters about half a mile along the road, the way it worked out. So there's kind of that brick kiln feel of the neighborhood that developed later. And then there was the Brookses, and the Brookses came with quite a bit of money. Thomas Brooks, the father of Caleb and Gershon and Joshua, was pretty well endowed. He moved back to England, actually. He didn't stay in Concord for his whole life. But he got big land grants out there near Brook Meadow, and his three sons, kind of Caleb, Gershon, and Joshua, divided up the land. Then Caleb moved back to Medford or something, so the other two guys ended up with it. And you can see the way they held their household there, and those are guys in the second generation. And then if you go to the right top, up to the third generation, that's like 4 sons of Joshua who have now subdivided all that land, plus their cousin Daniel Jr. And yeah, amazing. This was quite a well-off family. Those are much bigger pieces of land than the Marion brothers had. And of course they had the tannery. And that was usually in Joshua's line. And that was a big engine, economic engine for them as well. Then you go to the lower left and you're up to the 4th generation, and look at them all. These are brothers and cousins with all this intermixed land. And about 6 or 7 houses that were in sight of each other, and since the land was cleared a couple decades ago, you can sort of stand there in the middle of the Brooks area and see all those houses. They lived in these little village, kind of little clusters, neighborly clusters with Kent for all the generations of the colonial period. And the thing of this is, and then you can see again, it kind of stabilizes. And these were reasonably prosperous people. They were, many of these guys by the late colonial period are citing themselves as gentlemen in their deeds rather than just yeomen. They had an Indian, of course, as well, tavern. They were doing quite well. And I won't go into it right at the moment, but we will in a minute. But all those lands you see are a big mix of meadowland and pasture and all those things. And I'll just do one more of these. That's another half mile to the east, and now we're up to the Hartwell area. And the Hartwells, remember we started with John Hartwell, who lived back in the center. His sons also lived in the center and did not move out to that area in the east, but his grandson Samuel Hartwell did, and built the house. Was there until it burned down in the 1960s, and now there's a frame around it and a chimney stack. That stack house you see on the Samuel Hartwell's land, and he built that in the 1690s, so that's the 3rd generation as well. And since I wrote the book, I discovered Samuel Hartwell's my ancestor. I'm descended from this guy. It's amazing. And then again, next to him, Benjamin, that students from Livermore, it's later the Joseph Smith House, has another block. And you can see as you get further to the center, it's more possible to have consolidated land, farms, and get all the different kinds of land that you need within it. Because to run this system, you need all these different kinds of land. You need the wetland for the meadow, you need rocky lands that are kind of hold water really well, so so that makes good pasture. Orchard land, you need tillage land. One thing about the Hartwells is that that rocky site where the house is, because Samuel's, obviously the next generation, Samuel's son, Ephraim built the tavern. But his tillage land, you can see, is a half a mile to the east, because there's a nice piece of kind of light, sandy land there. Sandy loam, and that's still in cultivation to this day. He doesn't have anything up here at the homestead that he can use for tillage, and that's quite unusual. In most cases, the tilled land is really close to the house and barn. But in this case, it worked out that it was a half mile away. And the reason it needed to be close to the house and barn was because you had to cart manure up to it. What's that? What's that? He did. They had orchards there, and orchards were sometimes extensions of the garden, so we commonly do see them close to the house, and we'll see that in a second. But they also started having orchards further out on the right kind of land. And in the 19th century, that became heavily orchard land. Hartwell still owned it, and they had commercial orchards up there, because that glacial till soil is rocky, but it's great for trees, and it's great for apple trees. You don't want them on land that's too sandy and dry. So that became a real orchard spot in later generations, yeah. They were learning how to fit these different parts of their farming system to the landscape, the very difficult landscape that they had, and make them work as a whole. And it took them a few generations to kind of work it out, but they did. And then they had to pass it on to like these gigantic families. You know, how are you going to find enough land for all these different kids? And they've got children again who are leaving and starting the whole process over again in Acton and then so you name it in this circle.
So I think I heard you say that you did 6 months of pay here versus 2 months in England. Why do they need more pay here than they would need in England?
Yeah, because it's much colder. It's a really easy answer. And this was a little ice age when they came over, but basically you've got a growing season that will not produce anything for the cattle to eat from the 1st of November, to the 1st of May. You've got 6 months. And in England, especially in southern England, that's just not the case. You have maybe a month or two where you got to feed in the barn. So they had to feed in the barn half the year, so you have to feed cattle today. You just have sheep. You need a lot of hay, and you got to go out and cut it. So it's an immense labor cutting hay as well. It's a big, strong guy who can cut an acre in a day of hay. So the haying season was long and difficult, from early mid-July through August. And in those days, they only took one cut because it was so much work. So they grew it out to the maximum size that they could get, which was, by August. And that kind of drove everything else in the labor cycle and feed cattle. The thing is, though, after you cut the hay, you wait a few, and this is still true today, you roughen the hay, you wait a few weeks or a month or so and you can graze it. So it becomes a secondary grazing resource. Later into the fall when the growth of grasses slowed down. So they had to work out all these kind of details, but the monster task was making the hay. And again, the way they knew to grow hay from England wasn't the upland hay we have today. That gradually began to develop. It was low-lying meadows. And so they had to take all those swampy lands and cut the trees off of them and dig drainage ditches, and this immense labor of taking basically a quarter of the landscape that we look at today, and it's all the maple swamps. That was the driving engine of this agricultural system, and the drainage systems that they put in place, like through the Battle Road section of the park, were amazing. And they changed things around. The Brookses changed the course of Elm Brook. They took a lot of water that had been coming down the hill and then coming through Millbrook down to the center, running west, and they turned it and made it run around Brookhill Island and attach with Elm Brook and run north. which caused a lot of difficulty and controversy because there were other farmers who wanted that water because, see, in the wintertime, they flooded the meadows. They found convenient causeways or whatever it might be, and they held the water back from them to collect nutrients. And the reason I know they did this was because of the court case that was brought against these guys who had diverted the brook, these guys specified that they needed to flood their meadows for the nutrients. They had no sediments. It's wonderful when you're a historian and you find somebody who said stuff like this. In 1735, yes, thank you. So they were very conscious of how they could use different parts of the landscape to support the different pieces of their very complex system. How the livestock part can support the tillage with manure, and you know how the meadows collect nutrients that flood down into them in the course of the year, and those essentially recaptured in the hay and brought back out and run through the livestock. They grew rye on dry sandy lands that they did not fertilize. They didn't cart manure to, so those tended to be further away. Most of the tillage lands, the home field, was right by the barn because you could turn the cattle out there during the winter, so they'd manure it directly while they're eating the hay, and then the manure that collected in the barn and in the cow yard right by the house, and barn you would then cart out in the spring to the corn crop, and you needed that to be pretty close. That was a big task. So they worked out all this stuff. And to go back to the Brookses, for an example, and the Merriams were the same way. One of the reasons they subdivided their tillage land in close was because they all wanted to have it close to their houses to get the manure onto. Go back to the Brookses and look right around here. I'm not showing the land uses, but basically this, and it's still there, was the Brookses' home field. And there's like 4 or 5 different members of these brothers and cousins who had chunks of that field where they were growing their corn. And that was because that was and it isn't a hell of a great field to look at either. But it was close and good enough, and they sought the number to it. You may read someplace about how these people wasted their neighborhood and all. I don't believe that. I have a deed from Concord Center that had to do with the stables and the meeting house. So when they went to church on Sunday, this deed had to do with who got the manure from those stables where they had their houses. Horses. They were extremely conscious of the importance of manure to their system, and it was a hell of a lot of labor getting it, carting it out, and putting it on. To the extent they could, they got the cattle to do it themselves. They would fence what they call a cow yard in a different part of the tillage field every winter, and the cows would go out there during the day. And they moved that next year. So it was a really well worked out system of farming they were doing, and I'm getting to tell you pieces of it, but if we go along a little bit further to that map, I'm sorry that's so small, but that's looking at the Battle Road from Mary's Corner, there at the west end, to the tavern, and a little further east, and that's the part of the park I'm mapped most closely. What I did was map all the land holdings that anybody ever had from then to now, about 2000. And from deeds and probated estates and tax valuations, I was able to piece together how much of those pieces of land were used. And so again, what you're seeing here all along the brooks are all these meadowlands that belong to different people, but everybody's out there cutting their meadows at the same time around the 1st of August. So that's the kind of driving engine of this thing, and they're all carefully ditched at the end of various places. And then the brown things are tillage lands. They're generally close to the houses. But there's some that are further out, like on Brookfield Island there, where they're probably growing rye, which wasn't. So rye and engine, as they called it, Johnny cake was their basic bread. Wheat, they gave up on wheat really fast. Another key resource in here this was mentioned earlier, apple orchard. Apples really suited this landscape well. They had difficulty growing barley. It takes quite a bit of manure again. They couldn't spare it, and you had to harvest it in August when they were exhausted just trying to get the hay cut. So barley did not fit well, so these people within a generation stopped drinking beer, not entirely, but mostly, and drank apple cider instead, because apples worked great in this landscape. Even in rocky soils, if it's good glacial till soil with a lot of water and nutrients, and that's where most of our orchards are today, they grow great apples, and they figured this out within a generation, and that was their major drink. The main reason for planting orchards was for the cider. And the other uses of the apples were kind of a side product. In the colonial period, in the 19th century, more of a commercial market for apples, dessert apples developed. In this period, those are mostly cider apples, but can be grown on seedling stock, right? So, and in fact, the seedlings sprouts and make really nice cider mix. So each farm usually had about a half acre to an acre of orchard to produce basically their basic drink, cider.
So, question about pasture land. My image of a pasture is an open field. We have a description from Reverend Ezra Ripley talking about some of the pasture land near Elmore Hill, Bloody Angle.
Right.
And he says it's wood pasture.
Yes.
So are pastures generally open, wood, or fenced?
Well, a mix, and that's key. So what would happen with a lot of pastures, they started out with the stock in the woods, eating away, and so that's kind of a wood pasture. And after a generation, or a human generation or two of doing that, you destroy the reproduction of the trees, and it becomes more and more open. And in some cases, they went out and cut down the trees and opened it up very quickly. But in a lot of cases, we get that kind of wood pasture thing going on, where there's still a lot of trees out there, and the stock are gradually eating the regeneration. So yeah, that's a bloody angle. And the other thing is, I'm trying to remember, on the east side of the bloody angle, there's a piece that for some reason, it's been a while, a few decades since I've worked on this, but I thought might have been a coppice as well. Because, as you can see, a significant part of the landscape needs to be left in woods, because these people really need wood as a resource. So they're clearing land, and in the process of clearing it, they're generating a lot of wood to use for their houses, and for their fences, and for their firewood. They're burning like 25 hours a year. But you're not seeing most of the woodlands in this map, which are green, that were there, because I didn't map the part further to the south, up toward Flint's Pond and Walden, and that was almost all woods. So there were corners of town, like Walden Woods, that stayed in woods right through the colonial period, even as everything else was being cleared, and most people owned lots up there, say in Walden Woods or around Flint's Pond or someplace, where they could go to cut firewood, timber, and so forth. Woodland was an extremely important part of this system. And in fact, it meant that by the end of the colonial period, when this system was really straining, it just could not fit any more of these types of farms. They couldn't really clear any more land because they needed about a quarter of the landscape in woods. And it wasn't until the 19th century, when agriculture commercialized and a lot of changes took place, that they drove woodland cover in Henry Thoreau's time down to about 10% and they expanded the pastures essentially to produce commercial milk in the 19th century. But in the colonial period, they stopped and they hit about a third. Because the wood was such an incredibly important resource just for everyone. This was a long age. So you can see they're kind of working their way into this landscape, passing it on to their kids, subdividing it, but then hitting a limit where you really can't subdivide it that much more, figuring out how the different pieces work together. Pasture was one of the most difficult and problematic pieces of this, actually, because it's hard to keep pasture in a fertile condition. The meadows that are producing the hay are inexhaustible because they're collecting all these nutrients when they flood. Any nutrients that are coming down off the uplands are essentially being recaptured in the hay and fed to the stock, then become manure to put on the farmland. Plus, they went out, and all those ditches you see, those blue ditches in the fall when it was dry in September, and they dug out those ditches, and they piled all the mud along the edge of the ditches and let it dry, and took that home to the cow yard so it could absorb urine and manure, and mixed in with manure. They put it in barn cellars, and they figured that all out. So that was a great kind of pump that was bringing nutrients back up to the tillage, essentially. And the orchards worked really well. Pastures were a problem because pasture works best when it's on glacial till, which holds water really well. But it's a gradual draw of nutrients out of that land. Especially if it's acidic soil like we have here. So after you've maybe cleared it and grown some trees on it and brought the pH up that way, after a few decades that effect is gone and you've got an acid soil, which means that legumes like clover don't look that well. If you want to grow clover, you really need pH of 6 plus. And they were nowhere near that. So they had a kind of real deficit in their pastures. It's hard to keep those things in good shape. They're just gradually taking nutrients out. I mean, you know, the manure and urine of the grazing stock returns about 3/4 of what they eat, but the rest is coming off as wool or meat or whatever, milk, especially milk. You might have. So the pastures were a problem, and by Henry Thoreau's time, by the 19th century, Concord is full of pastures that are highly degraded because they're full of huckleberries and juniper and cedar and the rest of that. So that was kind of an ecological flaw in their system, but it was a long-term one. Mostly they had pretty well worked out as to how to get a sustainable system that supported a lot of families in pretty decent style. And of course, connected to a vast array of artisanal trades that they were blacksmithing and all the rest of it that they were carrying on at the same time. I didn't think it was going to be this way when I started this research. Back in the 1970s and 80s, what we all thought as historians was they wrecked the land. They had so much land out in front of them, they just had to work their way through it, completed it, and moved on. And then I started mapping all this and looking at these families, and I get the same families, these Hartwells, my own ancestors and the Brookses and all of them for 4 generations, 5 generations, 6, into their, like, my God, they're farming the same piece of land. You cannot degrade a piece of land for 7 generations and still be living there and styling yourself a gentleman. I mean, something was going on, and my conclusion was that they were taking reasonably good care of this land. And again, some problems, and some limitations, but remarkably sustainable. I tried to resurrect these guys, because colonial historians have been done on them for so long, and they're my ancestors. So.
So, how much surplus are these farms producing that could then be turned into money?
Yeah.
Or are they more dependent on their side jobs like canneries and blacksmithing for that kind of thing?
That's just such a great question. So if you couldn't hear it, it's like, what does it take? How do you generate enough surplus to become something like a gentleman so you can buy some of the things that you're going to need to show off in your house or whatever it might be, live that kind of lifestyle. And they are generating a small surplus, but there are a lot of them looking in each other's pockets, at a very basic level where they're exchanging goods and they're exchanging labor and so forth, kind of weaving all these artisanal trades in amongst their own production. So it's not as though they're self-sufficient in the way we're going to grow everything that we need right on our farm. They did a lot of that, but a lot of it is trading with neighbors and trading work with neighbors. And they had, they kept all these account books that they drew a line at the end of the year and said, well, I'm a couple shillings ahead of you, and maybe paid off some of them. But then on top of that, you had to figure out how to produce enough surplus if you wanted to style yourself a gentleman, and it might depend on, again, as you mentioned, maybe you're like Joshua Brooks and Noah Brooks and that line. They certainly call themselves gentlemen in their deeds. And they're basically, they got a successful tannery. So that was their route to it. There's another class of gentlemen above this that have really become wealthy as merchants and so forth, like the Collins and so forth, that kind of come out from Boston. But it's a complex business of getting enough surplus. I mean, the surplus things they were selling, just the regular yeoman farmers were selling, were some of the wood products, like barrel staves and white oak for timber. It's a pretty good cash crop. They need to come up with some kind of cash crops to go along with their subsistence locally used crops.
So the farm surplus was not going to urban coastal communities?
Some was.
Some was.
Yeah. A lot of it was being traded locally, kind of evening things out. And of course, as you went through the life cycle, as a man or a woman, you had this period when your kids were in their teenage years where you had an immense labor supply. Oh my God, there's things you could do. But then you had to set them up with farms of their own. So you're kind of frantically trying to convert some of that to cash or to somehow get new land where you could set them up with land. And then you get a little older and it's just the youngest son and his wife, they're going to inherit the place. It was a complex economic system of both kind of this self-sufficiency within the farm and within the community with some cash surplus production. And they thought of it that way, as getting a comfortable subsistence and then maybe something on top of that. Very few of them were driving straight at the question of what can I do that's most profitable. That happened in the 19th century. Historians call that the market revolution. And part of it is a change in just mentality. Okay, we're not going to go everywhere here. We've got an expanding market, and some goods are starting to come in from other places. We're going to specialize and buy grapes. Live more of a middle class life. That's a 19th century thing. These folks are thinking in terms of settling their family, as many as they can close to home, but others with a good start in life so that they can gain comfortable subsistence too. Yes.
What did they have to do for money?
They had to support the clergy at a pretty good rate. I mean, the ministers did a good bit of work as well, but they were supported with cordwood and food and all the rest of that. So that was a part of the taxes that they had to pay.
What did they prescribe?
Yes. Yeah, pretty much. You paid it. One of the different kinds of taxes you paid was just directly to support the clergy. Which is one of the reasons, one of the difficulties as these towns expand is it gets to be too far to walk to the meeting every Sunday, and they want to split into smaller towns, and so eventually a town like Lincoln splits off from Concord, and the big fights are over who's going to support the minister, what's it going to cost, because the mother town is losing its tax base. A big part of it is just to wrap this up, it's okay. My argument is that it was a remarkably sustainable system. It had some things that may be going to be long-term problems. The demographic drive was overwhelming, so there were always kids leaving. By the end of the colonial period, Concord was full. You could not really find a farmland to pass on to your kids within the town, except for one. And then my daughter could marry some other farmer. The rest all had to leave or try to find some new artisan of trade to fit in. And actually, at the end of the colonial period, we start to see grain yields begin to decline, which they just couldn't find enough manure, and they couldn't find enough hay, as they interpreted that. They pushed the system to its limit. So if you read Bob Gross's great book, Men in Their World, that still really stands up that it was a system that wasn't degrading the land, but it had really pushed to a point of stress, great stress. And so I think everything Bob does in that book about how those kind of problems are driving some of the political it's spot on, but just that the system itself had remarkable sustainable elements within it. It's not like they just chewed their way through the land and wrecked it and caused themselves all kinds of problems and moved on. It was that demographic thing that was really strange. I mean, 8 kids average, 5 generations. It's a lot. And so, like, New England, 6th and 7th generation, that doubling, they were doubling every 25 years. Population, I mean, it was like 20 or 30,000 of these Puritans came over here in the 1630s, and there was a billion by the end of the colonial period. And that was almost all natural numbers. So the last doubling was from southern England to all of northern England, just right at the population. So that's kind of the gist of the story here. It's this very intricate, well-worked out system of using the land here, quite remarkable. But still with a kind of demographic engine that's driving it into a stressful position by the time of the revolution, just as Bob talks about. So that's about it. Well, I guess that's the basis of what I have to say.
All right, we have 10 minutes to get up and stretch, use restrooms before our final presentation. We'll dive into the Battle of Lexington and Concord and the Battle Road. Those we were joking earlier, you made it almost entirely through the 525, but now you have to face the boss level. See if you can make it through this next one. So, this is going to be a panel discussion, and our moderator, which is laughable, is Alex Kane. Well, just the moderator. He's our facilitator. So you'll have myself and Sean Constantine and the 17th Foot Ranger Jared Coos. So we'll be kind of covering different aspects of April 19, 1775, and in particular focusing on tactics. But first, words from our moderator, Alex Kane.
Remember, it's always about historical nerdry. For those who don't know me, my name is Alex Kane. I am the owner of the blog Historical Nerdry. Pretty excited when Jim asked me to come and moderate this event. And so I told him I was going to forbid words just to set the stage. And I decided when I was going to make some comments, I was going to take a different approach. And with my comments, and I promise I'll keep them under 3 minutes because these three have some amazing information to share, and I do not want to take up any more time. If we look at the state of research when it comes to Lexington and Concord, we probably can set one of the defining moments in 1976 with Bob Gerson's book, The Minutemen and Their World, which absolutely set the defining moment, set the stage for what should be exceptional research and what was considered a Buck approach when it came to reconstructing a community at that time. You move forward through the end of the bicentennial into the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. I call it almost a roller coaster of research. Some books came out which were absolutely exceptional. Others were like, what the heck is going on here? And by the time you got to probably around the 225th, there was actually this belief. We've researched everything we could. We've taken a deep dive in everything that we could. There's nothing else to do. Lexington and Concord are over. We're going to move on to other research areas. And I remember probably around 2012 or so, I was talking with Joel Bowie. It's around the time I first met him. And I was talking to him about how I would love to have my book published by a traditional author, but a traditional publisher. But I kept on getting the response, there's nothing new to learn about Lexington and Concord. To which Joel's response, and I'm giving the PG version, that's below. And that was in between his smoking of Virginia Slims and things like that. So I'd say there was a new defining moment where in 1976 we had Bob's work, but I would say probably about around 2012, 2013, we had a series of defining moments that set the stage for research and development of what took place in Lexington and Concord. And the first event was led by Minutemen National Park, and they are the leaders of our research. More recently, with the archaeological exploration of Parker's Revenge site. I do consider that an absolutely defining moment. And we got an opportunity to take a look at what were the positions of Captain John Parker's men, what were the weapons that possibly could have been used, what were the tactics that were employed at that particular site. And it sort of inspired historians, and you all are historians, to take a deep dive and look both within your own communities as well as different other aspects of the day. We had on the one hand people like John Bell, who was pumping out information, as well as Don Hagus, who took a deep dive into the makeup, what is the biographies and the demographics of the British soldiers on the day. We had perspectives looking into civilian evacuations, as well as child witnesses and loyalist guides who were out. And as we continue coming into the 250th, we're taking even greater deep dives. We had the opportunity, for example, to talk to Gregory Burge, who was able to create the 18th century material culture website, where pretty much, you name it, and it's relevant to material culture, it appears on the site. Currently, we've taken, in addition to archaeological exploration, we now have, and I am going to make a pitch for him, Joel Bowie's recent book, which literally came out, I believe, within the last couple of days, where actually there is a forensic study of what took place on April 19, 1775. So with that, I am absolutely pleased to introduce three gentlemen who are now going to be taking a deep dive into what took place between, I would say, Oaks Hill and Concord Hill during the April 19 fight. This is a period of moment where, one, you had several bloody engagements taking place. You also had a moment where the British Rome was about to collapse. And so, there's been assumptions in the past that, hey, there's just individuals who picked up, left their farm, went to the fight, and changed it for home. There's other historians who thought it was a simple line of that battalion fired. But what I've heard and what I've seen from these three gentlemen over the last 6 to 9 months, what they've been researching is actually very cutting edge. In certain little nuggets, for example, that Sean shared with me, you pass over it the first time, you don't think about it. But when they put everything together in the big light, it suddenly goes, oh my God, I never thought about that. That's how they made the fought that particular day. So with that, I have the absolute pleasure to introduce Jim, Sean, and Jared. I will try to moderate, but I would encourage questions to be posed to them right away, because I did listen to White Snake too much in the 80s, and my hearing was absolutely. So with that, for an introduction, we'll turn it over to Jim Collison.
conversations I had with Alex. It was at Battle Road one year, and somehow we got on the subject of Whitesnake, and I was like, come to this shocking realization. I'm having a very serious conversation, in-depth conversation about Whitesnake. What is happening right now? But never mind that. So what I'm going to do is just give an April 19th overview. So this is going to be really, really quick. So the amount of detail that I am not going to cover is going to be absolutely shocking. But this is really intended just a brief introduction to the military situation leading up to and on April 1775, and then we'll be hearing from Sean and Jared to discuss more in depth on tactics. So I'd like to start with two quotes. One, of course, is from General Thomas Gage to the Viscount Barrington, November 2nd, 1774. If you will resist and not yield, that resistance should be effectual at the beginning. You think 10,000 men is sufficient, send 20. If 1,000,000 is thought enough, send 2. You will save both blood and treasure in the end. A large force will terrify and engage many to join you. A middling one will encourage resistance and gain no friends. So basically, poor Gage is saying, send lawyers, guns, and money because, finish that statement. But of course, London wasn't listening. He got this letter in January 1775, it arrived a little later, from Lord Dartmouth, Colonial Secretary. The violences committed by those who have taken up arms in Massachusetts have appeared to me as the acts of a rude rabble, without concert, without conduct, and therefore I think that a small force now, if put to the test, would be able to conquer them with a greater probability of success than might be expected from a larger army if the people should be suffered to form themselves upon a more regular plan, to acquire confidence from discipline, and to prepare themselves, without which everything must be put to the issue of a single action. Now, regarding the rude rabble, have the militia, and this is reviewed, I'm sure you all are very familiar with this. It included able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60, with a whole laundry list of exceptions, and they were required to keep arms as according to law. Company trainings were usually 4 times per year, plus 2 additional days for instruction and inspection. Those exempted from training included Indians and Negroes. They were also still required to be armed, inspected regularly, and to respond in the case of an alarm. So, enslaved black men in the area, free black men, they were prohibited from training, but they were required to be armed. So if you were a household who enslaved a military-age man, you had to keep arms for him. In October of 1774, Gage refused to allow the Massachusetts legislature to sit. And in response, they formed themselves into the provincial Congress and assumed legislative and military control of the province. And they recommended right away, they delved into military affairs. They recommended reorganizing the militia, electing new officers who were politically reliable, and that's following the advice of the county conventions, and also that the towns form Minuteman companies, elite companies that were ready at a minute's notice. And minute companies, unlike militia units, which were, of course, obligatory and have to serve according to the law, minute companies were raised by voluntary enlistment. They trained on average twice per week, and of course, ready at a minute's notice. And the Congress also allocated more than 20,000 pounds, based on the committee recommendation, for the procurement of arms and ammunition and supplies. And by February, they stated their goal of raising a Massachusetts army of 15,000 men. And they also set up a committee of safety, which was going to be in the provincial Congress that really got to focus on military matters. The committee of safety took steps to establish a very detailed network of alarms. So it said, noted, this is what this chicken scratch reads, noted that the watches be kept constantly at the places where the provincial magazines are kept, and that the clerk write on the subject to Colonel Barrett of Concord, Henry Gardner, Esquire of Stowe, and Captain Timothy Bigelow of Worcester on the subject, leaving it to them how many the watches shall consist of. Noted that members from this committee belonging to the town of Charlestown, Cambridge, and Roxbury be desired at the province expense to procure at least 2 men for a watch every night, to be place in those towns, and that said members be in readiness to send couriers forward to the towns where the magazines are placed when sallies are made from the Army by night. They also, that very month, established when the Army, their Massachusetts Army, should be mobilized, or the militia forces as well. So that whenever the Army under the command of General Gage, or any part thereof, to the number of 500, shall march out of the town of Boston with artillery and baggage, it ought to be deemed a design to carry into execution by force the late acts of Parliament, the attempting which, by the resolve of the late honorable Congress, ought to be opposed. And therefore, the military force of the province ought to be assembled. So by April of 1775, the rebels have a well-organized fighting force, a line of communication, and a clear understanding about when to mobilize. And into this hornet's nest, General Gage sent Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and a force of between 700 to 800 soldiers on an expedition to seize and or destroy the military stores at Concord, one of the principal magazines, about 20 miles distant, about northwest from Boston. Now, the British column consisted of 21 companies of grenadiers and light infantry drawn from 11 different regiments, in all between, as I said, 700 to 800 men. The grenadiers are the elite of the Army, chosen for courage, physical strength, stature. The light infantry were chosen for speed, stamina, and intelligence. They are trained to move quickly, to spread out, take cover, and skirmish with the enemy. Now, the British began assembling at Boston Common around 10 p.m. and ferrying across Charles River to Cambridge, and it took a long time, and they had to wade through the tidal marshes, and they were finally assembled on the road to Concord somewhere between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. They began marching. Now they're going through the town of Menominee, heading towards Lexington. And when they got there, Lieutenant Colonel Smith detached his second in command, Major John Pitcairn of the Marines, with 6 companies of light infantry to push on to Concord and to secure the north and south bridges, basically secure the town, open up a corridor for the main body. And he also sent a messenger back to Boston to request reinforcements because they were hearing around them all the sounds of alarm. And they realized the enemy knew that they were coming. And they also heard disturbing rumors that 500 men were going to be waiting for them in Lexington. So they arrived in Lexington around 5:30 in the morning thereabout, and met Captain John Parker and the Lexington militia, armed and formed in battle line in the town common. So shots were exchanged, and the Lexington militia got worsted by far. 8 militiamen were killed and 10 wounded, 1 British soldier lightly wounded. Now, having put a stop to the firing, Smith was determined to continue on with his mission instead of turning back on Concord. Now, I should note that his orders are to take care of the soldiers, do not harm the inhabitants, plunder the inhabitants, and such. So this mission is really going off the rails, but they're going to carry on. They enter Concord around 7:30 in the morning. The light infantry advanced along a high ridge north of the road, while the rebel militia forces withdrew across the Concord River by the North Bridge to the high ground about a half-mile northwest of the bridge. The British also sent troops out to North Bridge. 3 companies were left to hold it, so it's about 96 men, while 4 companies advanced across the river to Colonel Barrett's farm to search for artillery and other stores. So Colonel Barrett is really responsible for the military supplies in town. And then 1 company was sent to hold the South Bridge, and the rest of the column divided up and searched the village. At 9:30, 3 companies holding the North Bridge were attacked by a strong force of about 400 Minutemen and militia. In the exchange of fire, the colonists lost 2 killed and 4 wounded. The British lost 12 men, 3 killed, 9 wounded, and among the wounded were 4 out of 8 officers who were commanding the bridge. And fighting at the North Bridge was also the first time the colonists were ordered by their officers to fire on British soldiers. So now Lieutenant Colonel Smith is in a desperate situation. He has wounded to secure, and he also has to regroup his scattered companies. And he was finally able to do that, including the companies that he sent forward to Barrett's farm. because the colonists that took the bridge didn't hold it. And really, it's the holding that's the most important. But either way, he's collected his force again in Concord by about noon, and they begin their return march to Boston. But by now, militia forces are converging in on that area, and they attack them at a place called Marion's Corner, which is about a mile and a half east of the town center. And as one volunteer from the Reading Militia, Edmund Foster, wrote, "The battle now began. It was carried on with little or no military discipline or order on the part of the Americans during the remainder of that day, as each one sought his place and opportunity to attack and annoy the enemy behind rocks and trees." Okay, I'm just going to talk to you. Again, from Marion's Corner all the way back towards Boston, the British colony was engaged in a prolonged firefight with colonial minute and militia companies, which continued to stream into the area. And Lieutenant John Barker of the 4th Regiment footnoted, "In this way we marched between 9 and 10 miles, their numbers increasing from all parts, while ours was reducing by deaths, wounds, and fatigue. We were totally surrounded by such an incessant fire as it's impossible to conceive. For ammunition likewise was near expended." They did meet up with reinforcements in Lexington about 2:30 in the afternoon after some delays. 1st Brigade finally arrived with 1,000 infantry and 2 field pieces, 2 6-pounders. And that saved them, as Hugh Percy, commander, said, "I had the happiness of saving them from inevitable destruction." But then, after a rest, the brigade plus Smith's battered column have to make their way back towards Boston. And Percy takes the road north into Charlestown, which actually avoided a pretty serious ambuscade that was planned in Cambridge, across the river. But finally, by about 7 o'clock at night, the British columns of the brigade plus the flank battalions cross into the Charlestown Peninsula, and they establish a defensive position on Bunker Hill and also covered by the fleet, and the militia drop off for the night. Combined losses for the flank company and the brigade was 273 killed, wounded, missing. 95 colonists were also killed or wounded. But also, bigger numbers here. In the Lexington alarm, there were 4,000 Minutemen and militia who received the alarm, mobilized, and actively engaged the British column in combat by the end of the day, on April 19th. Within 3 days, 20,000 Minutemen and militia responded to the alarm and began moving towards Cambridge. Now, General Gates, remember those letters at the beginning? General Gates wrote on the 22nd of April to Viscount Barrington, "The whole country was assembled in arms with surprising expedition, and several thousand are now assembled about this town threatening to attack, and getting up artillery, and we are very busy making preparations to oppose them." And to me, this stands out as one of the most politely worded "I told you so" letters in history. Okay, so I'm going to turn things over. I'm just going to pull up this PowerPoint. So now we're going to talk about British tactics with Sean Constantine of the 17th Regiment.
10 minutes, to talk forever if given the opportunity. While Jim gets that up, can you guys hear me? Take this out, that looks a little bit better. Sadly, I probably don't actually need this on level, but we'll use it. Those in the back. All right, so this is a British military quick start for Battle Road. This is talking about tactics once again. As Jim said, this is incredibly overdue. I have 10 minutes. I'm not going to hit everything. Luckily, we heard a little bit earlier from Alex about British line tactics and 18th century warfare. So hopefully we'll put that in there. And if you've never actually seen me out in the field, I am that rear guard officer losing his mind. And you will kind of see that as a theme as we go through. So please. So, British military in the 18th century. It is actually important to kind of understand this, and I can't give a presentation about the British military without talking about the English Civil War at one point in time, because the British military is totally different from the rest of continental Europe, because it stems out of the New Model Army, and there is a different tradition. The British Army has always been an army of volunteers. It originally stems, if you think like Agincourt and everything like that, you have a volunteer army that is coming up, they are going out for a campaign, and then they are done. But that all changes in the 1640s when the English Civil War starts. That creates the New Model Army, and eventually that would dissolve and would become the institution that is the British Army. It's different from the Navy, it's different from the other departments, because the New Model Army exists because of the fear of tyranny of the king. So who actually controls the British Army? That's a real interesting question, and even to today, you find that the King of England is the commander-in-chief, but it's actually being funded and it's being allocated by Parliament. So you have these checks and balance systems. So they are volunteers. That is one thing that sets them apart. Every person in that army is a volunteer. They are there. They are enlisting for service for life. That does not mean until you keel over and die. That sometimes means until if you're actively at war, like during the 7 Years' War, a lot of men, they are getting pensions afterwards because they were worn out from all of that hard living while they are out way of war. So when you're done, you're done. There is a 1-year training period, and the army is different than many of the other continental European armies because they're going out and practicing. They are one of the few armies that is actually firing live at least once a year. So not only should the men in theory know how to fire, but they actually know what it feels like. And again, going back to the English Civil War, there is this fear of large standing armies. It is not something that English society and British people embrace. It is a linkage to tyranny. If you have a large standing army, you are kind of like those Popish French, those Popish Spanish. In fact, in 1774, during the Quebec Act crisis, one of the things that the papers are publishing is that Guy Carleton is about to raise 60,000 Catholic French Canadians to come down and put the Bostonians under Lord North's boot. So you see these veiled threats of tyranny and all sorts of things dealing with that. And also, by the way, it's a family system. There's education, it's value. There's a whole bunch of training and betterment of that. So very high level on 18th century tactics. As Alex went into, it's not necessarily about making every guy on the other side of the field no longer breathing. It's about taking the field of battle. They are these small exchanges that are going to affect boundaries on a worldwide level. You see that a lot during the 7 Years' War, where there's a victory over this area, but it's causing land exchange in the other years' war. Fighting in North America is different from fighting in Europe, and the people that are over here know that, both on the rebel side of things and on the British side of things. Gage was here during the 7 Years' War. Hal knows all about what's going on in North America. They fought over here. They know that things are different because you can't have these large line infantry battles that you can have somewhere over in France or in Prussia. And there's a lot of changing tactics and ideas that are going on at the time. Two of the big names in the British High Command are Gage and Hal. Both of these men were proponents of light infantry as more junior officers during the 7 Years' War. And now you find that these guys are now in charge, and they're able to take their ideas and things that they've come up with, and they've been able to put them in practice. And the last thing to remember is that the British Army is adaptable. It always has been. All the way from the 1740s, you see fighting during the Jacobite Wars, fighting during the 7 Years' War, and then into the American Revolution. The British Army is constantly evolving, and they are adapting. It is something that makes them good at what they are doing. So, things about the Boston garrison. Boston's an occupied city. We all know that. They're talking about it in the papers. They actually start calling it the Siege of Boston by 1774. There are routine training and exercises going on. The regiments are going outside of the city. They are walking, they are marching around in the surrounding areas. They are practicing, they are drilling, they are doing movements. So number one, this does two things. It gets them familiar with the land, it gets them familiar with the environment and things that they may be encountering in the routes, but also, could that be a little bit of counterintelligence? If you are a local in the surrounding Boston area, and you see British regiments out there marching every single day, drilling, practicing stuff, you're not going to think that much of it. You desensitize the people from a counterintelligence perspective. When something's actually about to happen, people may not have an eye, now have the element of surprise. And the last thing to remember is that the officer corps the officers corps a lot of times tends to be people who are more educated. They're out there, they know what's going on in the politics. Of the MPs, I looked through the House of Commons and I was going to do a tally of how many MPs in the House of Commons in 1775 were also military officers, and I stopped because the number was getting rather large. So, and by the way, a lot of them tend to follow the lead side of things. So, April 19th, or as I like to call it, we're having a bad day. So the flank companies of Grenadiers and with light infantry, they're set out to Concord. As Jim said, they're set to form up at 10 p.m. They actually get rolling at 11. They don't actually start marching until 2 p.m., 2 a.m. At this point in time, these guys are wet. They've had to wade through water. Guess what? They've been given provisions. Those provisions, by the way, include ship's biscuit and salt pork. You need to soak the salt pork, and you need to soak the ship's biscuit. I'm not sure if any of you try to eat it all. It's not great. So they really don't have that many provisions that they're given. They're also fighting in mixed battalions. These guys are not fighting with their normal officers. They're fighting, yes, as a group, and the British Army would be well known to do mixed battalions throughout the war. But this is not guys that they're really familiar with. So you do have some learning curve as you're figuring out who all your officers are. The other thing we have to deal with is fatigue. These guys have been up since 10 p.m. the next day. Now they're going out, they're wet and cold, and they're marching 14 miles all the way to Concord. It's not fun. Ooh, that's not good. Okay, so the bad day continues. As Jim said, they go out to Concord. We all know what happens. Then Percy's relief column comes in. So Percy's relief column has a bit of an interesting story to it because Gage had the forethought of like, hey, let's get everyone up and ready in case we need to go out. Unfortunately, those orders were either misdelivered or were not read. So it's not until Smith's orders actually come back on that messenger about an hour after he sent it off that Percy actually knows that, hey, it's time to go, I gotta get my men going. That delays them by almost 4 hours. They should have been ready at 4 a.m. They don't get off until about 9. His men are short on ammunition. Although they are going out, they are only carrying 36 rounds. That's 2 government sets. It's not a lot. They also don't have food on them. They don't have extra provisions. You now have wounded men to deal with, and you're dealing with the constant harassment from the Massachusetts militia. So as I said, they're having a bad time. But, okay, so here we go. This is the fun part. This is what I want to see. How are they moving? We all talk about the column. Right there in the middle, I have the most oversimplified column illustration that you will ever see. So in the front, you're going to have your vanguard. There is an arrow there. I can't see that come off and everything. But that is the front of your column. In the middle, you're going to have your main column, and then you have your rear guard that protects you. On the outside, you're going to have your flankers that are being made up primarily of light infantry, but you'll put anyone there if you need them. The point of this is fluid. So if you're thinking about this in terms of April 19th, we'll think about this in Percy's Part 2. He is placing the vanguard on the front. They are trying to blast their way through to get them back to Boston as quickly as they possibly can. He is deploying the Royal Marines to do that because they are a large body that can get through. They're securing areas in front of them. In addition to that, he's also using the flankers. So while the vanguard is starting blasting, he's also going to have those flankers out there in that light infantry to scout out the area as needed. So that way they can clear the way. Your main column, that's Smith's battalion. These guys are hurt, they're wounded. You have your main bit within that area, but your reserves that are coming out from your vanguard and your rear guard are also taking place there as well. And then your rear guard at the end that is protecting your rear. The 23rd is one of the primary regiments that serves in the rear guard, but Percy, realizing what is going on, what's happening, and that constant harassment from the rear by the rebel militias, he is rotating his men out. So he is using the main column to his advantage, so that way men are able to rest, and that way men are able to conserve their ammunition, and can continue to fight for 5 hours until they make it back to Boston. So, how are they fighting? Like I said, the British Army is adaptable, but we haven't quite gotten to Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1776. So they're still fighting in close order in a three-rank system. That causes some issues. So we can see in Doolittle's paintings, they are fighting, in Doolittle's engravings, they are fighting mostly in three ranks. You can see the men lined up that way. It does lead to one problem, because every single time you fire in the third rank, that front rank has to take a knee, then the men have to move. So they're not quite as fast as they're going to be later in the war when they're firing in two ranks. Now what's interesting is that there is an ensign who actually notes that as they're approaching, as Smith's column is approaching Lexington and the men are breaking down, he mentions that he tries to get the men to form up into the two deep. So they are attempting to fire with in a two-rank system. It was done previously in 1758 when Amherst ordered that as part of the New York campaigns across all of North America, but it's something that hadn't really been done. So they are adapting even on April 19th. Other things that we know that they're doing, they're employing maneuvers like street fire, which will allow you to blast away within a confined area. It looks really good on the battle road. It's a way to effectively cover your rear in one area where your sides have limitations, either from streets, from buildings, or that is just the width of the road. But it can lead you into some issues when, let's say, you're on the north ridge and you're trying to fire in one direction when your enemy is firing on you from about 360 degrees. The last thing they're doing is they're firing while advancing and firing while retreating, so they know what they're doing. They're ensuring that they are covered throughout the entirety of the day, and they're sending off flankers. Now there are some instances, I think we'll get that in the Q&A about the flankers, but they are employing them, so that way they're able to scout the land, they are able to know where they're going and what dangers they will have. Unfortunately, for that, as anyone here has ever walked on the battle road, you know that the terrain is never changing. It's wider, it's more narrow, it goes up, it goes down, it turns, and that leads to a lot of issues with both Smith and with Percy as they try to make their way back to Boston. I think that's the end.
Well, I gave Jim permission to get too excited about that. I went over time. So I'm going to try and keep it short. Yep, I'm going to go over here. Because I also pace when I'm talking. So, hello everybody. Again, my name is Jared. I've never been the extra host of the pad. But I'm going to do just a little bit of overview of my fancy slides about militia tactics on April 19th, 1775. I'm going to start this with a question that you all have to participate in. And the number one thing that we often get asked at Minuteman is, most people come running to Minuteman thinking is, how many of you have heard that age-old tale of the militia win on April 19th because, number one, they're using rifles and they're hiding behind the trees and the British soldiers don't know how to do anything but march in the middle of the road. How many of us have heard that before, right? Yes. Keep your hands up if you've ever seen or read April Mornings. There's a lot of weird overlap there. Tommy's not here for him to accuse me of ruining his childhood. Which I will say, that movie gets more right than it gets wrong, and if anybody has questions about that, we can chat afterwards. It was in April, that is correct. But this idea, where does it come from, right? Because this is something that persists, and I feel like, as Alex was pointing out, we talked about this over and over and over again. For anybody who has studied the Battle Road, anybody who's been to Battle Road, right? It looks a little different than that, and you might be seeing a little bit of a theme that we've been building in over this afternoon, setting up, first of all, military tactics with Dr. Alex Burns, and then the overview of the landscape on April 19th-ish, about that time period, right, is trying to bust a little bit of those things. So what I'm going to talk about is where that idea came from and what the militia were actually doing. And as you can imagine, I don't really blame a lot of people for getting their idea of what battles looked like in the 18th century on Hollywood, because since the time this battle happened, there have been a lot of different versions of the story that's told about this battle, and a lot of different versions that were created for specific reasons, right? So if you look at some of the earliest accounts of the fighting on April 19th, it seems to kind of line up with some of those misconceptions that we have today about how the battle unfolded. And some of those come from British soldiers, right? Now you gotta keep in mind, when people write accounts in the 1770s and even afterwards, many times they have an agenda in mind, right? You read those accounts and you start to see, oh, I see what they're getting at here, because they're writing for an audience many times. And you start to see that reflected in some of these soldiers' accounts, right? In Richard Pope's account from 47th Regiment of Foot, he would remember that day focusing primarily on demonizing his attackers, right? Demonizing the militia. Pope would say, "We received a hot fire from all sides. In this manner we fought our way back through a strong, close country, every wall lined and every house filled with wretches who never dared show their faces." Right? And that starts to set up a little bit of an idea. Again, he's writing for an audience back in England about what happened that day. You also see accounts that say things like, "They did not fight us like a regular army. The rebels were monstrous numbers and surrounded us on every side. When they came up, we gave them a smart fire, but they would never engage us properly." Right? So we're starting to build on some of those things that Dr. Alex Burns was bringing up about combat in this time period. And I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler of my argument with militia on April 19th, is that they knew what they were doing. They were employing tactics that were tried and true. They had been through these types of experiences before. So this idea of a rabble of soldiers that don't know what they're doing, put that out of your head. Right? Because again, a lot of this is being crafted, specific narratives over the 18th and 19th century, and especially in the 19th century, because I'm sure many of us have read 19th century accounts. Even some of the participants on April 19th wrote many of those accounts 50 years later, in the 19th century, when everything has been already established, right? One of the number one accounts that we read on the Battle Road is that of Edmund Foster from Reading, right? He participated on April 19th, but as Jim read earlier in our presentation, he talks about how there was little to no military discipline recognized by the soldiers, the militia soldiers on April 19th, right? He's setting a narrative 50 years later that really puts forward that battle farmer idea, right? We stepped away from our plows, we've gone out, this rabble of soldiers, and we did the impossible. Again, we're setting a narrative 50 years later, but as we do the research, we start to see these guys have been training. They have been trained. Regular militia service, right? Jim talked a little bit about that. They are well prepared for what's going to happen on April 19th, 1775, and the British Army knew that. I'll thank historian Don Hafner, I think he's still here someplace, who, yep, he's back there in the back, who pointed out to us last year in a memorandum of intelligence sent to London on March 4th, 1775 by General Gage. He would write, "Should hostilities unhappily commence, the first opposition would be irregular, impetuous and incessant, from numerous bodies that would swarm to the place of action, and all actuated by enthusiasm and wild and ungovernable. Much more is to be apprehended from their patience and cunning in forming ambushments, where the light infantry must suffer extremely in penetrating the countryside." Right? So again, this idea of an unorganized militia that has no idea what they're doing, even Gage knew this is going to end badly for us. However, he had a job to do, and those soldiers on April 19th also had a job to do. So when we actually get to the Battle Road, we gotta look to the sources, right? We've already established they know what they're doing, they're using tactics that have been employed in militia service since well before the 7 Years' War, well before the French and Indian War. They're also starting to train in 1774, late 1774, looking at some newspaper accounts, right? Sean loves looking at newspaper accounts, and we found one from, we think, Mr. Pickering from Salem, who is writing kind of a military doctrine at this time period, and he's actually going to talk about using dispersed tactics, right? He's encouraging soldiers to run when they're out in the field maneuvering. He's also encouraging men, if they're going through broken countryside, to disperse their lines, to reform in other locations. And when we start looking on April 19th at how the militia are fighting, it's very similar, again, because they've been through this before. And again, you start to look at some of the accounts on that day, and I highly recommend you all do. You get really into some of these narratives because they'll tell you a lot about the battle that day. like we said, Edmund Foster, that account that he wrote, he said, the battle now began. It was carried on with little or no military discipline and order on the part of the Americans during the remainder of the day. Each one sought his own place and opportunity to attack and annoy the enemy from behind trees, rocks, fences, and buildings, as seemed most convenient. Now again, that sounds like militia are just scattered, running about. But if you take that into context with some of our other accounts that we have on the battle road, you start to see some patterns that are showing up from these militia soldiers. First, the idea that they're just scattered and they're not working together as a military force should. You should put that you put that on your mind as well, and you see that in some of the accounts, such as Major William Baldwin, who was commanding a battalion of men from the town of Woburn. Baldwin and his men had marched south. They'd gone through Lexington that morning. They had arrived in Lexington Green just moments after the British had massacred some of the Lexington militia there on the Green. Angrily, the Woburn men marched off in the storm. They started heading towards Concord, but in fear of running up into the backside of the British column, they cut further south. They went through the center of downtown Lincoln, and they would go kind of a circumnavigational route that would bring them out on what is Brooks Hill, just to the west of where we start Battle Road today. As they were there, they would take position, basically pitching and refreshing themselves, taking a break, and from there they noticed the British column coming out of the town of Concord. They decided to reposition themselves. And Baldwin would write, "We came to Tanner Brook at Lincoln Bridge, and then concluded to scatter, and make use of trees and walls to defend us and attack them. We did so and pursued on, flanking them. Mr. Daniel Thompson was killed and others, till we came to Lexington. I had several good shots. The enemy marched very fast and left many dead and wounded and a few tired." So again, you take Baldwin's account, you put it into context with Foster and a few of the other accounts we have from that day. If anybody wants to see some of those, I have plenty of examples. But you start to see again patterns that are showing up. Number one, the militia are using the terrain to their advantage. The British column is moving very quickly because they don't want to stick around to figure out what happens when 4,000 militiamen descend upon them in a single location. But you'll also notice, on the opposite side of that, there's not really any moment on April 19th the militia tried to completely cut off the British retreat back to Boston, right? They're not trying to destroy the British column. They're trying to inflict as many casualties as they possibly can, which again is going to lead to a specific type of tactic, hit and run tactics. You have companies of men like that from Woburn and elsewhere. Parker's company later in the afternoon. We see this in the archaeological record, where these men are entering into the field of battle from tertiary roads that lead them to the course of the fight. They're engaging the British column from long distances, because again, we've established through research, much of it thanks to Mr. Joel Boyd here in the back, about the types of weapons that they're using, right? Smoothbore weapons, no rifles on battle roads. You can tell everybody you need to know, no rifles, we know this. However, those guns, they're lethal, right? Out to 300, 400 yards, even if they're not necessarily accurate. The militia know this. They've used these types of tactics before. So, hit the British column from a long distance, maybe do it from cover, behind a stone wall, an orchard, behind a house, or inside of a house, outside the ability and the capability for the British light infantry to catch up with them. By the time those flankers have been deployed or they pass through the area, those militia soldiers are gone. And they're flanking out and around the British column to catch them at another bend in the road or someplace else that they can get in front of them. But when you have 4,000 militia soldiers, they're doing this on April 19th, 1775, it creates a rolling tunnel of fire the entire way down the battle road. In fact, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith would say after the fighting commenced at Miriam's Corner, where the beginning of the battle road is within the Minuteman National Park, there were scarcely 5 minutes for the entire rest of the day where they were not under continuous fire, right? That is 14, 15 miles, 7 hours of continuous combat all the way back to Boston. And again, the militia soldiers know what they're doing. They're using the tactics that they have learned from previous conflicts, and they're using the terrain to their advantage, which is going to force them to use those tactics. This is not necessarily a rabble. It is a well-organized, well-trained group of soldiers who know exactly what they're doing. Right?
So first of all, thanks for these three outstanding presentations. Before I open it up to the floor, I actually have a couple of questions myself that I want to pose. And I'm going to start off with Sean, particularly with light infantry tactics. You had referenced, I appreciate that you said that they were adaptable, which actually I really didn't look at that way. I appreciate that. I know in some of Don Vegas books, he had referenced various light infantry drill manuals that had come up on the eve of the American Revolution. I believe Hive had founded one, there's Townsend in Ireland. Looking at particularly the light companies that went out that day, could you expand the audience here just a little bit? How well versed were they? And add a second about that. Have you come across any evidence where perhaps there was just inconsistencies within the training, where perhaps one light company was trained one way and another light company was trained another way?
So to answer your question without actually answering your question, so yes, light infantry is the new thing. Using that being said, it's the result. We have components of it and both how and later comes in engage. They are two of the very early proponents of it and some of the developers of it. Now, the British Army of 1775 in North America is not going to be like the British Army in 1777. That is pretty much everyone is trained in some light infantry tactics, but you do have the understanding, the adaptability, and the training. So really what to harp on is not necessarily the fact that everyone was trained as light infantry, they can all do it. What they do possess, because they are in a specific area, and they have specific goals that we know that they're going to go out after look at 74, the powder alarm, early 75, Leslie's expedition, which, by the way, go and see it sail on the New York Times site in February. That comes out. You might recognize Colonel Leslie. But what they do have is a familiarity of training. So while an understanding of light infantry tactics may, on a large 30,000-foot view, look like a great thing to have, it's actually more is the familiarity and the fact that they kind of do dress rehearsals of this several times. I like to think of April 19th not necessarily as an expedition gone wrong, but as a military reenactment gone poorly. Because they already knew where they were going, they knew what their goal was supposed to be and what was supposed to happen. What wasn't expected was the fact that there was going to be a train of fire and rebel forces actually being commanded to then attack this British colony. So there's the answer to your question, but I actually answered your question.
All right, now I'm going to put Jared to the test. And Jared, you talked about some of the militia tactics of the day and how it seemed, although it may have been decentralized, it wasn't central control. One of the things that stood out when we were talking to John and I on the sidelines is this influence of Timothy Pickering. If you look at Timothy Pickering's drill manual, even has a section in the drill manual for Rangers in various light tactics. And as I learned today, Timothy Pickering may have been that mysterious person who was writing articles. I just want to ask you, could you just expand a little bit upon what Pickering was doing? And secondly, sort of flipping from what Sean said, have you come across evidence of other treatises or articles or anything that the militia were relying on to base their tactics on?
Yes. No, absolutely. And I'll start the answer with this, with the idea of, again, how the militia are structured during this time period, right? They are British, right? So the pre-war time periods, the provincial Congress are actually going to prescribe to the militia that they should standardize their drill, they should standardize their approach to military tactics. They're going to use the 1764 annual exercise, right? So they're trying to get everybody on the same page. These are lessons that were learned from previous conflicts. Again, back to the 7 Years' War, back to the French and Indian War. So Pickering will become a much bigger name as the war goes on, but famously about this time period, he is working on his own treatise exercise, right? And it comes out kind of contemporary with all this going on, but these, again, he's taking lessons that have been learned in previous conflicts. He's reading about these lessons from other treatises, and he's putting them together. Much in the same way, von Steuben is going to kind of standardize Washington's army later in the war, as we joke around the von Steuben, which is that they take all their manuals of exercise and they slim it down and they make it more efficient. And that's almost what Pickering is doing in the lead up to all the events that break out here. So he's taking specifically writings that are coming in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, about rangers. And we don't necessarily have what would be considered rangers in the 7 Years' War that are popping up in this area in 1775. We get some weird variations of light infantry that we thought that they were light infantry, they were actually more light infantry. But the concept of rangering during the French and Indian War came with its own very specific set of regulations. And there are a number of officers who had just after the French and Indian War started writing their own treatises talking about how they found the best, most efficient ways to fight, particularly indigenous people during the French and Indian War, because they are adopting tactics and other things that they see indigenous people doing, French soldiers doing, and what's going on in Europe at the same time. So they're taking all these things, they're amalgamating them together, and they're using those ideas in the post-French and Indian War time period to write their own manuals. So Pickering is reading those things, he's starting to compile them together, which is another good thing to bring up as I conclude this section, is that there are many men in service on April 19th, 1775 who have been in military service for most of their lives, right? They were required from 16 to 60 to serve in your town militia, which means many of these militia soldiers have seen active campaigning. Few of them have seen combat before. You have men that have gone to carry on, that have served throughout the French and Indian War. You even have men that are going down to Coringa to fight during the 7 Years' War and other previous conflicts. Many of these Massachusetts militia soldiers really should be just considered soldiers, right? Even though they are farmers by day, they are volunteers sometimes that are going out on campaigns much farther away and they're getting a lot of experience. Or they're hearing about that experience from other people, they're starting to apply it. So this kind of gets to the base of my argument of they know what they're doing on April 19th. This isn't just a fluke, happenstance that they just start swarming the British column. These are things they have been thinking about. These are things they have been planning for. This is just a moment that they can exercise those abilities.
And just to add about command and control, do we have evidence of this? Yes, we do in the archaeological record. Well, first of all, in the historical record, Edmund Foster, after engaging British Imperial corner, he said, after that fight, he writes, "We saw a wood in the distance which appeared to lie on or near the road the enemy must pass. Many leapt over the wall and made for that wood when we arrived in time to meet the enemy." So that, he didn't say we were ordered across the field, he said many leapt over the wall. So people are making snap decisions, but they were arriving in mass, which means there are people among them who know what they're doing. The other thing, when we investigated Park Revenge, we really hoped to find the battle site on this rocky hill overlooking the road, because it's so dramatic and it's such a great story. You can almost picture Parker and his company with their flag planted saying, "Come and take it." But that's not what we found. And Joel, of course, after when they were doing the, hi Joel, when they were doing the investigation, they started to really find some evidence. He called me out to the battle site and showed me what they found, and nothing on that rocky hill, but in the woods, on a wooded, rocky ridge line. So they had good cover, good concealment. Their position covered the road. They covered the bridge over a seat that the road had crossed, so it was a natural choke point. The British had to pull in their flankers and go across the bridge. And also being out on that ridge in the woods, their right flank was anchored by that seat, by that brook. So they couldn't be outflanked. So not only did they have good cover and concealment, they had good line of sight, avenues of approach, and retreat. So they could egress, they could get out of it and head down the road and fight another day. So you saw evidence, really for the first time on Battle Road, physical evidence of tactical thinking. Somebody thought about that position very carefully.
And as a final editorial note on Mr. Pickering, I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. Mr. Pickering gets I guess a raw deal as a result of April 19th. Supposedly he held his forces back. But an interesting footnote, he lobbied very hard, I'd say probably about November of 1774 to about January of 1775, where he actually tries to convince the Massachusetts Provincial Congress to reconsider the instruction, hey, Massachusetts forces should train with the Crown Manual. It was actually trying to promote his own manual as the official drill of the Massachusetts forces, which it was taken and it sort of went off to die at that point. So with that in mind, before I throw my final question out to the panel, I wanted to open up to the floor. If the gentleman back here had a question, I would just ask you if you could keep your voice up, because again, White Snake did horrible things to my hearing.
Sure. So about this issue of command and control of the militias and all, is there any indication that there was any particular leader that led the militias from the Fort Bridge by the back trail over the Imperial Corner? I haven't found it.
No. No, so when it comes to the movements after the fight at the North Bridge, right, there's a little bit of, well, I shouldn't say a little bit, there's a lot of confusion that immediately is going to pop up after that, because you see, first of all, during that fight, basically the first third probably of the militia column are going to go chasing after those British soldiers that are running back towards the town of Concord. Those men will actually end up on the hillside above what is the Elijah Jones house, which is technically the Bullet Hole house today. And from that position, they will meet the British reinforcements that Smith had sent out from Concord Center to reinforce what was going on the bridge. And there's a pause. Both sides are forming up, they're ready. One of the militia soldiers said, we could have killed every one of them if we wanted to, but they didn't. Because, again, with the confusion, they don't really know how far they're willing to press this, so the militia retreat. As we were talking about earlier, they go back to the other side of the bridge, they take a position on the high ground on the other side. Some of the other militia also did the same thing. Some guys say, you know, I'm done, that was enough for me, I'm going home. But there's another few hours that will pass between the fight at the bridge and the British expedition leaving the town of Concord. And in that time period, number one, you're seeing a lot more militia soldiers that are starting to show up. They're being commanded by higher ranking officers. You have guys from different towns that are taking command. You have companies that are marching in from different directions. And what you're going to see, and what we've actually been looking at in primary sources over the last few months, is what we think is there are companies of guys that are going in different directions at different times. And I think that gets to the concept of every man for himself sort of idea, right? There's no single officer likely that's saying, hey, go over to Miriam's Corner and catch them as they're coming out of town. These are decisions that are being made in the moment by the soldiers that are there, maybe by their field grade officer, right? Maybe a captain says, okay, we gotta go in this direction. We don't have any written necessarily documentation that says this guy told me to go here, but by looking at some of the accounts we have of guys from different companies, you start to see a picture emerge where you have men that are going to the north, they're going to the Great Meadow area, they're flanking around the hillside. They're going to arrive there in front of the British colony before things are going bad. You have soldiers from Concord even, some guys that are going north, you have soldiers from Concord that it seems like they're going through the town, following the British colonists that are retreating out of the town, because they show up late to the fight at Marion's Corner after the shooting had already started. And then you have guys who arrive at Marion's Corner before the British colony began fighting. There's one guy from Congress who gets to Marion's Corner, goes beyond Marion's Corner to what he said was the Beacon Mining House, which is just about a quarter of a mile down the road. And then he goes to the south side of the road to take his stand. Right, so that means he got there before the British exited the town. So what we think happened is that there are all these different units that are moving however they can to the best, most advantageous position, because they know, again, the British colony is going to have to leave Concord at some point in time. So it's unlikely there's one person saying go to this place or go to this place, but it's kind of a mutually agreed upon situation. You have guys that are going and guys that want to. So I'll turn to Jim. Additional thoughts.
Yeah, another possibility that could be aiding some semblance of command and control. It's a wonderful military advantage where you not only know where your enemy is, but where they're going and how they're going to get there. Because they know they have to follow that Bay Road. Of course, Percy throws off pursuit temporarily when he takes the North Road to Charlestown, but right up to that point, everybody pretty much knew where they were going. Reverend Samuel West's diary, memoir, said we can track their progress by their platoon fire. So you can't see them, you can hear them, you can see the smoke. So again, you're going to know where they're going to go, you can anticipate. So if you're a captain or a lieutenant or a sergeant, you can start making those decisions based on really good intelligence.
Something we don't talk about all that much because there's a whole lot of research, but we do see some evidence of it, is the communication that's going on with April 19th. When we think about the alarm, the midnight alarm, right, we think about all the riders and orders being sent out, all these different town sectors, that is continuing to happen throughout the course of the day. You have different amounts of men going in all different directions, relaying information back and forth, back up to the sub-area company, right? We think that some of the sub-area companies split off in different directions because they're getting different information at different times. So it's evident that there are lines of communication that are directing resources other than just gunfire that's going on that day. So when we think about communication on April 19th, also there's a lot of people on the roads that are going everywhere spreading this information.
The only comment I'll add to that is there's also accounts from Anvil. Anvil was kind of interesting. They never engaged that day, right? For reasons we're not going to get into. But there are accounts from Kane Stevens, who's an Anvil Minuteman, describing how Anvil was basically zipping back and forth towards Lexington, towards Concord, and then back to Lexington, because they were just getting spontaneous reports of where the problem was. So you have that as well. I believe you have a question also.
About getting to alarm after the it's very evident that they already had communication lines set up from Arlington and Salem before the bridge actually brought up. So my question is, there's all this advanced thing about communication. How much advanced planning about the military response do you think there is in terms of getting
So, how much you're going to get in terms of primary source now, unless we have someone saying these are really all forwards and everything like that. It's going to be hard, but luckily we have something better. We have power. We have, this is already happening. And when power alarm occurs, we have the reports in all of the Massachusetts papers of the numbers, the sheer numbers of men that are turning out on horseback and on foot and are making their way to Boston. And they're doing this in 1774. They're doing this in a smaller scenario than we're dealing with on April 19th of 1775. So we know that they're capable of doing it because they've already done it. And then you see it again with Leslie's failed expedition. So it's not something that we do to any of these countries. It's not something that we do to any of these established communication networks. It's already happened. The reports of Grant, and this is coming from harmonious and aristocratus, I believe, the pen names of the person who writes the article in April of 1774. But he's talking about 10 to 15,000 Bostonian men turning out. And by the way, he says they do it with great military order and organization, that they march on Boston without a word being said. That's a direct quote, by the way, without a word being said. So we know that they're already there, and we know that they can do it rapidly and quickly because it's already happening.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Because we have the killer snowstorm coming, we're going to wrap it up at this particular point. I do want to thank our panelists. I mean, highly encourage you to stay in touch with these three very talented gentlemen. And I'm not saying that because they're moving behind me. These are three individuals who, in the short period of time over the last couple of years, have made light years of progress and revealed so much more research than was previously known. Definitely make a point to connect with them, definitely pick their brains. They have a lot of stuff they get very excited to share with us. So with